Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Claudia. For some unfathomable reason, I've always enjoyed washing dishes, something my family has never understood or altogether appreciated. I'm certainly not a clean freak, but I do enjoy washing dishes in warm soapy water, and the pleasurable feeling of that warmth on my hands that filters through my rubber gloves. I usually pile the rinsed dishes neatly in the dishwasher for a final wash, so that when I remove them from their cycle, they sparkle as if they're brand new. It's things like this that I find oddly comforting. I suppose we all have our oddities in our lives that bring us pleasure, and this is an absurdity of my own. Our kitchen overlooks fabulous views onto the long red brick driveway of our home. I love looking out at those views, especially when I'm washing dishes. I can hear the television blaring in the living room, and the spirited, argumentative voices of my two children, Tyson, who is 9, and Jennifer, who's 8. I can hear the annoying sound of the television blaring loudly in the living room, and the spirited, argumentative voices of my two children, Tyson, who's 9, Jennifer, who's 8. I can hear them squabbling between each other about what to watch on television. It is so typical. I guess they're fighting over the remote control, which predictably happens every evening without apology. In my experience, kids will be kids, and my children, they're no exception to that rule. They can never agree about what to watch on the box. My husband Graham is sorting them out. Right, that's enough, kids. No more squabbling, you hear me? I tell you what, we'll toss a coin, shall we, to see what we can watch tonight on the box. Is that a deal, or is that a deal? I think it's very fair, don't you? The peppery, fervent argument between my two children promptly subsides, although I can hear my daughter saying, "But I really want to watch Ridiculousness, Daddy. I like Ridiculousness with Chanel West Coast. Tyson wants to watch those horrible, ugly trucks with the big wheels. I hate the trucks with the big wheels. They're so boring. I want to watch the funny stuff. I like the funny stuff." I smile contentedly to myself as I place another plate in the hot soapy water and sponge away the stain of food on the plates. My husband always knows how to sort out the disputes between our kids, and his strategy of negotiation is far superior than mine. The weather is miserable outside, which makes me feel oddly cosy being stuck indoors like this, while the rain thrashes indiscriminately down our roof, leaving drops of water drizzling down our glass panes, which has somewhat thwarted and rather clouded my view this evening outside the kitchen window, which of course is a tad disappointing. It is dark outside. The pearly moon tonight is obscured behind some murky cloud cover, which often happens when it rains. I'm used to the rain. It happens a great deal in our part of the world. We live close to the Wenatchee National Forest in Washington State. We moved here about 2 months ago, as the property is very spacious. It's a stone and wood double-storey bungalow that I fell in love with at once. And I'm not the kind of person that tends to fall in love with bricks and mortar, but this bungalow offered a lifestyle to me that made me think of the Waltons. Me and my husband Graham saw it as the perfect place to raise our two rambunctious children. By all accounts, they love it here almost as much as I do. It took a while to persuade my husband Graham that we should move out here, and that it was the right thing for us to do. He thought we might feel a little cut off from civilization, which is ridiculous given that the nearest town is less than 25 minutes away from us. But I guess when you're out here, you do feel very alone with the trees and the indigenous fauna and flora, and you can get the false, rather misleading impression that the civilized world is a whole galaxy away, which of course is far from true. In the very beginning, it took a lot of adjustment to move to the countryside, as I was a city girl born and bred, and was used to the sound of heavy traffic, the obtrusive annoying honks of taxicabs, the breaking sound of a bus, the chatter of people's voices shouting at each other across the sidewalk. So being interrupted at night by different sounds, like the wailing wind whistling through the trees, or the strange haunting animal sounds that echo through the woods, would make me in the beginning feel rather discomposed. But I guess I'm getting used to it now. I'd say to my husband, "What the hell is that?" And neither of us would know. But every night we heard strange whooping sounds, muted howls, squawks from the woods, and sometimes I could swear we would hear a woman scream. But I'm not about to try and locate the source of those strange noises. Sometimes it's best to live in ignorant bliss. Well, that's what I think anyway. So despite having to make adjustments to our new lifestyle, I have welcomed gladly the change from life in the city to life in the country. I think we've become much more relaxed and easygoing, not permitting the stresses of everyday life to get us down in the way they used to. Sometimes I feel as if we're living in the middle of nowhere, as the properties in our part of the world are spread out magnanimously and are surrounded by remote country roads and a plethora of trees everywhere you look. But in our area there are ubiquitous amounts of horse riding trails and fabulous walks that you can enjoy a stone's throw away from the house. It's the kind of idyllic spot that generously invites into your living space an abundance of indigenous wildlife. Shortly after we moved here, a mother cougar brought her cubs to frolic around on our patio. It was almost as if she took absolute delight in introducing them to us. She appeared remarkably tame. I got the profound sense she was showing off her cubs to us, as if to say, "Look at my offspring, aren't they absolutely marvellous?" and was so typical of any proud mother. So we've seen it all out here. It's not uncommon to wake up in the morning to see deer scampering over the lawn, and I just love it all. One thing I've learnt about living here is never to rely on the weather, for if the weather was your girlfriend or boyfriend, you'd dump such an unreliable, fickle partner in a heartbeat, knowing full well that he or she would find it impossible to remain faithful to you. When I first moved to this part of the world from Houston in Texas, I would always listen to the weather forecast promising a great sunny day, and 2 minutes later the sincere, reassuring promises were rudely dashed when it suddenly bucketed down with rain. I soon learnt never to rely on the weather forecast and to always travel with an umbrella, come rain or shine, as my personal insurance policy, guaranteeing I won't get caught off guard and return home from a shopping trip looking like a half-drowned kitten. I have one of those short, stout umbrellas that fits rather snugly in my shoulder bag, that I take with me everywhere I go. Regretfully, it's got used rather too frequently of late for my liking. My family have just finished eating dinner, so they're casually relaxing in our living room, feeling fully satisfied. Ostensibly much like the cougar we've encountered, I'm a very proud mother that takes delight in taking care of her offspring. I thoroughly enjoy cooking, much like washing dishes. I find cooking rather therapeutic, which has to be a good thing, as I wistfully fantasize about myself becoming one of those indispensable country housewives that makes everything from scratch, from their own bread to butter and cream, although I've got a long way to go to become like the barefoot Contessa, but it is a work in progress. For dinner I've cooked pancakes tonight, filled with chicken and mushroom in a creamy sauce. It's absolutely delicious, even if I say so myself. It's an Italian recipe the family always thoroughly enjoy. One of the quintessential tricks is to add a touch of truffle oil to the mushroom sauce, and it takes the sauce to a whole new level that even my unsophisticated kids appreciate. My little boy Tyson says to me, "Mummy, why do you make mushrooms taste so much better than anybody else does?" I don't tell him about the truffle oil that I add to the sauce. I guess I want my son to believe that his mother has got magical abilities, like Aladdin's lamp, and can turn a dowdy plate of mushroom sauce into a sensory experience that titillates the taste buds. It was my mother-in-law that first introduced me to truffle oil. She bought me back a bottle from a trip to Italy, and let's just say I'm hooked on using the stuff with chicken and mushrooms every time. Our greyhound Juniper is sitting next to me on the kitchen floor by the sink, waiting patiently for any leftovers to be thrown into her bowl. Juniper rarely appreciates my cooking, and if there's chicken and mushroom pancakes going spare, you can bet she'll raise her paw to request a tasting. She's always exceedingly worried she'll be overlooked after our dinner is eaten. But that would never happen under my watch. I have a passion for dogs. I remember on a recent visit to Turkey, I bought food for the street dogs there, and I'll never forget the appreciation in their dark eyes as they tucked into large pieces of chicken kebab and pita bread, looking at me as if I was some kind of demigod. And to them, I suspect I was. Juniper is in luck tonight. 3 pancakes are going spare. She gobbles them down appreciatively, licking her chops, looking at me adoringly through her soulful dark eyes. I always give Juniper leftovers, and my vet tells me she's got one of the healthiest coats he's ever seen. So it would seem the tidbits she gleans after meals appear to be enhancing her health exponentially, although I haven't mentioned to the vet that my dog's diet includes the odd extravagant indulgences like truffle oil. One thing my family does not know, that I haven't cared to divulge to them, is that I am aware that there is a Bigfoot on our property. From the moment we first moved here, when I was on my own during the day, I'd feel certain I was not alone, and that I was being watched. I told myself I was being absolutely ridiculous. I thought that I was so used to life in a city that I must be imagining things. But one day in my peripheral vision, I could swear I saw a dark face staring at me through the kitchen window. I felt the eyes on me, but when I quickly turned around to look through the window, nothing was there. Another thing that had been so bizarre is that whenever it rains, my washing that would be drying on the line was always rescued and placed on the table of my wraparound porch, as if someone or something had rescued it for me. Very often at night, when I'm washing the dishes at the kitchen sink, I've seen the Bigfoot, a very dark, black, shadowy silhouette, with a bullet-shaped head, moving across our driveway through the trees of our grove. For a moment the figure stops, and the yellow eyes stare in my direction. I have often wondered if the critter can see me, but there is no way he or she can look in through the kitchen when it's dark outside. Or maybe he can, I don't know. Whenever he crosses the red brick driveway, it looks directly at me, almost as if it's returning my gaze. I get the profound sense that he or she knows I'm watching him, although I guess it would be difficult for the critter to stare in at me. The first time I saw his distinctive shadowy form cross our driveway, I nearly dropped a whole pile of dishes on the floor. I was astounded, my heart pounding in my chest at a dime to a dozen. I didn't know how to react to what I was observing, and for a moment, like I always do, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, and was obviously deluding myself. I thought, no, that couldn't have happened, until the event kept replaying every evening like Groundhog Day. So I knew what I was seeing was no trick of the light, no tug of a wild imagination, leading my mind mischievously astray. For me it was like I'd been thrown off my perch, as if I'd been hit by a miniature earthquake, as a sighting like this shook my view of the world, like the snow in one of those pretty glass globes you can shake really, really hard, and usually it plays a musical tune for you. I remember thinking to myself, surely not. I had closed my eyes very tightly, to open them cautiously again, and the creature was still standing there watching me, as if he was saying to me, "Yes, I am real. I know you don't believe I am, but get over it." I always get the bizarre feeling that he wants me to see him, that he wants me to know he's watching me. And I guess that should make me feel unsettled, but it doesn't. Even from the kitchen window, I can feel the Bigfoot's benevolence. I do not get the impression I have anything to fear, although I dare say, if I got close to the creature, I'd probably have a heart attack. It would be a daunting experience for me, I'm sure. I don't think he would hurt me, though, especially if he's generous enough to take down my washing from the line when it's raining. That shows great emotional intelligence and great compassion. Every evening I see him, almost as if he's patrolling the property, as if he's on guard duty. I know this sounds bizarre, but I get the impression he's watching over my family to keep us all safe. And that is a very cosy feeling. The Bigfoot is always carrying something in his overlong arms. Rather like a dead squirrel, I suspect. I'm not sure if he's alone or not. In truth, I haven't seen any more of his kind on my property. I'm referring to him as a male because for some irrational, incongruous reason, I suspect he is. He just seems to have a male energy about him. And even when I view him from a distance, I can see he's absolutely gargantuan. I always see him like clockwork when I'm washing the dishes at night. But tonight, even if he's standing watching me through the rain, I will not observe a thing. The rain has sadly obscured my vision from the kitchen window, which saddens me because I've got fond of my fleeting sightings of him every night. I've grown attached to seeing him regularly. I feel an absurd kind of connection with him, as strange as it may sound. I guess it's like sitting on a train every day, if you're commuting to a city, and you see the familiar faces sitting opposite you, giving you a polite nod. You don't know them in person, but you're acquainted with them by sight. If you saw one of them in a shop, you'd likely smile at them, because you know them, even if you don't, if that makes sense. You might turn around and say to your friend, "I know that person over there. They travel with me on the train every morning." And yet you really don't know them at all. You may wonder why I've made no mention of my strange Bigfoot sightings to any member of my family. Believe me, I have my good reasons. I just want to keep this secret close to my heart. And for some absurd reason, I selfishly don't want to share this encounter with anyone. My sister-in-law, Simone, has become my best friend in recent years, and I usually tell her everything, but I've never told her about the idiosyncratic visitor on our property. She once told me that a friend of hers thought they'd seen a Bigfoot here in Washington State. And do you know what? I said, "Oh, I'm sure she's mistaken." I didn't want to admit to my best friend that these creatures are real. I'm not sure what that says about me. I will admit that my son, despite being so young, got very attached to the television program Finding Bigfoot before I'd seen the creature for myself. "Mummy," he cried out happily, "I like Bigfoot 'cause he's real." I told him that no such idiosyncratic creature existed in North America, because if they did, there would be evidence by now. Those were my famous last words. My husband Graham made a face at me as if to say, "How could you be so mean to our son? Why don't you at the very least humour him?" Tyson was in tears, saying, "Why are you so mean, Mummy? He's real! He's real! I know he is! I've seen Bigfoot myself running across the yard, and he saw me too. He even smiled at me." I told him he was talking nonsense, and to not make up tall stories like that, because it wasn't good to lie. But now I don't think he imagined what he saw at all. It makes me wonder if my son saw the very same Bigfoot I'd been watching from the kitchen window. My sister-in-law, Simone, doesn't have any children of her own, not from want of trying, of course. She has told me always to listen to what your kids have to say, and not to always put it down to their imagination. I realized in that moment my cursory remarks to my son that I made about the Bigfoot had been unkind, but now I know the ambiguous creature does actually exist. So I guess I've got egg on my face, but I'm not about to eat humble pie. Not just yet. My pride does have a habit of getting in the way. I have tried to look for the mysterious Bigfoot in the daylight hours, by taking random casual strolls in the woodgrove with Juniper by my side. But I hasten to say I've never seen anything, but the feeling I always get in the woodgrove is that I'm not alone, and that I am being watched. But when I look around, nothing is ever there, which makes me feel as if I'm going a little crazy, although Juniper does appear to see something that I cannot see with the naked eye. She tends to run up to this particular tree in our woodgrove and jump up and down, very excitedly, like she does when she's greeting a friend of ours. It's an absurd thing for her to do. The tree in question is a tall oak tree, and on several occasions I've found long dark strands of hair on that tree that I suspiciously suspect belongs to the Bigfoot. So maybe Juniper is seeing and observing things that I can't. I do know that animals have extrasensory perception, and Juniper is always fixated on that tree for some reason, as if she's seeing something that I cannot see. It's all very, very odd. I'm so disappointed that on this night it is so wet outside, and the windows are so misted up that I'll never get to see the Bigfoot. But one thing I cannot mistake is the flashing of blue lights as a truck rolls down our driveway and parks discreetly outside our front door. A niggle begins to tickle at the pit of my stomach, nature's ominous warning that all is not well. In my quintessential experience, police do not arrive at your house after dinner in less than agreeable weather, unless something is terribly wrong. I hurriedly remove the rubber gloves from my hands and throw them onto the plastic drying tray on the side of the sink, and release a huge troubled sigh that comes out from the pit of my stomach like a nasty gurgle. Juniper nimbly trots out of our kitchen, down the long passageway towards our front door, and sits down promptly on her haunches in patient expectation to wait for the visitors to be greeted and invited into our home. She has never barked for some reason. Juniper does not feel the need to communicate with loud barks, which is something I am permanently grateful for. I glance through the archway of the living room, where my family, oblivious to the arrival of the police, are slothfully stretched out across pieces of furniture, with their eyes angled towards the television. I sigh with relief, knowing that they are fighting fit and strong and in good health, apart from a mild screen addiction, and my husband is in good form, eyeing the television with a slack jaw. So my family is safe and sound, and that gives me enough comfort and encouragement to gather up the strength and the courage to answer the front door. But when I hear the loud, formidable knock, I almost jump out of my skin. There is something ominously unnerving about the tone of that knock. It sounds authoritative, not friendly. Somehow one is never emotionally prepared to answer the door to the police. Then an image of my beloved father swings into my mind obtrusively. I get a flash of his beautiful, engaging white smile, his thick glasses that frame his kind blue eyes, his thin, wispy hair, peppered by grey, and I suddenly feel biliously sick. Please God, may nothing dreadful have happened to my dad. My mother died a long time ago, and my father is all I've got left in the world, so losing him would be absolutely devastating for me. My husband Graham calls out from the living room, "Claudia, sweetheart, will you be a dear? Will you answer the door? I think we have a guest." I wonder privately to myself whether my husband Graham would be in such a dreadful hurry for me to answer the front door, if he had any idea who was standing on the other side, because these are the kind of visitors no one would gladly welcome. The rapping continues, and I brace myself for the impact in receiving these unwelcome visitors into our home. They can only be bringing with them bad tidings. Otherwise, why would they even be here? I straighten my back, which is something I have always done, to give myself a bit of courage. I speedily walk over to the front door, gingerly opening it with a vacillating hesitancy. I peer through the open crack at two officers both wearing Burberry trench coats. They look cold and wet. "At least it's not the kids," a gentle voice whispers into my head. "At least the kids are all right." My husband is safe in the living room. Graham returned home early from work this evening, claiming he wasn't feeling great, but in truth I don't think he was sick, as he had seconds of my meal tonight, and in my experience when my husband is ill, he makes a poor showing with his food. The officers are wearing uniforms. One of the cops I suspect is in his 30s, the other probably in his late 40s, although I can't be sure. I've never been good with age. The expressions on their faces are grim, and I can taste the bad news before they even utter a word. My heart lurches with a nervous trepidation, and for a brief moment my legs seem to almost be cemented to the floor, as I stand there in the doorway, gawking at the officers, as if I'm staring at a flying saucer on our front yard, from which 2 green men have suddenly emerged. I'm trying to digest the absurdity of what I'm seeing. 2 officers on our doorstep. It's not a pretty sight. "May we come in, ma'am?" they ask me politely. "Is your husband at home? We are here to speak with a Graham Hancock." "That's right. That's my husband," I say, bouncing back to reality. "Is everything all right, officer?" I ask nervously, my eyes narrowing suspiciously as I study them. The officers remain stoically composed. Their serious expressions give nothing away. I take off their wet trench coats, hanging them on the hooks in the hall, which they seem to appreciate. With a pounding heartbeat, I lead the officers into the kitchen. "You wait over here," I tell them. "I just don't want to upset my kids. Please just take a seat at the breakfast nook. I'll call Graham for you. He's in the living room with our children watching ridiculousness on television." "That'll be most kind of you, ma'am," says the older of the 2 officers, studying me through his brown hawk-like eyes. I am certain I have seen pity in them. I walk hurriedly towards the living room, standing in the doorway, my legs trembling beneath me. My husband, on sensing my presence, looks up from the television. He's been laughing at something on ridiculousness, as someone gets whipped cream all over their face, and his dogs are licking the cream off his skin, and my kids are roaring in delight, pointing at the screen in abject amusement. Chanel Westcoast is saying something like, "Yuck! That is so gross!" Graham's face goes grave as he looks at me. Who's at the door? What's wrong?" he asks, as I stand, still trembling. "It's the police," I whispered, so that my children can't hear what I'm saying. "They want to speak to you." My husband gets up from his comfortable wing chair, and even at 6 foot tall, he suddenly appears very small, as the colour fades away from his face. He's become so grey. He suddenly looks rather sick. He follows me into the kitchen very somberly. I feel as if I'm watching an ominous movie, of which my family are playing key characters in this drama. We're acting out a screenplay, where a regular suburban family is about to have their lives dramatically turned inside out, like the washing in your linen basket. My father always taught me, from when I was a young girl, to learn to prepare for bad news, because at one point in our lives it will always affect us. He'd say, "I want you to remember, Ladybug," which was his nickname for me. "Life is not always a bowl of cherries, and it is not always fair." The officers have not taken a seat at the breakfast nook like I had persuaded them to do, but they seem glad to be seated after my husband insists that they take a seat. I hurriedly rush over to the electric socket on the wall to switch on the kettle, as the act of doing something eases my trepidation. My hands are shaking violently. My heart is pounding violently in my ears. It's almost hard to hear what the officers are actually saying. "I'm Senior Constable Watkins. This is my younger partner, Constable Rothford," said the older of the officers, looking directly at my husband. "Are you Graham Hancock?" "Yes, that's me," says my husband, laughing. My husband unfortunately inappropriately always laughs at the wrong time. He laughs when he's nervous. I think for him it's a self-soothing gesture, which can be very embarrassing. I remember he once laughed when a good friend told him his mother had died in a motor car accident. He had laughed and told him how sorry he was. "You think it's funny?" his friend had asked him. "I've just lost my mother. Are you seriously warped in the head to find this funny?" He didn't appreciate that my husband laughed to ease the discomfort of the awkward situation. It's a coping strategy, I suspect. I just hope he doesn't laugh with what the officers have to say next. That isn't going to be a good look. I then remind myself that maybe this fortuitous visit from the police has nothing to do with us at all. I mean, the police always canvass the area, don't they, when there's been a robbery of some kind? I persuade myself that this is why they're here in our kitchen. Of course it is. I'm suddenly looking forward to that moment when everything is fine and I realised how paranoid I was. I'll be telling Graham what I thought the visit was about. I'll say to him, "You're never going to believe it. I thought your mum had died or something terrible like that." Graham would lightly roll his eyes and chuckle. "Why do you always worry, Ladybug?" Graham also calls me Ladybug, after he heard my father calling me that name, and I guess it kind of stuck with him. I anxiously edge forward to take a seat next to my husband, and that's when I know unequivocally that my worrying is absolutely not unfounded, by the beleaguered expressions on the officers' faces, which are as dark and overcast as the gloomy, bleak weather outside, which has refused to abate and is wantingly reflecting the now melancholic mood of the entire kitchen. My children, who were previously completely caught up in their television programme, have now come bolting into the kitchen at a very inopportune moment, wearing their cute pyjamas, their bright little eyes growing round with surprise when they see the officers sitting with us. "Why are the police in our kitchen?" my son asks. "Go back to the living room, sweetheart," I say. "Me and your father are having a private conversation with these nice officers. We won't be long. Now quickly go back to the living room." My two children reluctantly obey, walking away with Juniper trotting behind them, her tail dangling between her legs, as animals are quick to pick up on the lugubrious energy of a household, and ours has suddenly sunk into a dark depression. "First, I need to confirm with you, sir, that you are relatives of Elspeth Hancock." "Yes, we are," said my husband. "She is my mother." "Well, I'm sorry to inform you," says the senior constable. I close my eyes tightly, waiting to brace for impact, almost as if I'm in an aeroplane that is about to experience a colossal crash landing. I already know what he's going to say. My mother-in-law is dead. Claudia's account, 10 years before Elspeth's death. I'm not sure what I expected when I first met Elspeth Hancock. I guess I'd expected my future mother-in-law to welcome me into the Hancock family with open arms, like another daughter, but my hopeful expectations were sadly derailed. I was left feeling bitterly disappointed. Graham had never warned me that his mother could be as cold as a fish, nor had he told me how wealthy his parents actually were. Graham had told me his father was in the medical profession, so I assumed he was a doctor of some kind. Graham was so ambiguously vague with all the details regarding his childhood and his parents. I had nervously asked him whether he thought his parents would actually like me. He'd slapped me on the back as if I was a bloke and said, "What is all this about? Of course they will love you. How can you possibly doubt that?" "But what about your mother? How does she actually feel that we're engaged to be married? I mean, she's never even met me," I'd asked him obsequiously. "What if she doesn't like me, Graham?" He had tweaked me affectionately on the cheeks and said, "Ladybug, for goodness sake, you worry far too much. Of course she'll love the bones of you. Besides, she's not marrying you, is she? I'm the one that's marrying you." He did have a point. I had smiled happily to myself, imagining the perfect mother-in-law, with pale blue eyes and an effervescent personality, who would sweep me up in her arms to give me a large, effusive hug, and say, "Welcome to the family." The kind of woman I could happily exchange recipes with, and meet for coffee in the local town for a pleasant chit-chat. But I'm afraid that wasn't to be. Elspeth Hancock was not the kind of potential mother-in-law that I'd actually envisaged for myself. It really is a pity you cannot choose your in-laws. Well, so I thought at the time. But there you go. I was in for a rude awakening. I was to discover that my mother-in-law was very aloof. Her face when she met me was as emotionless as a white piece of paper, and I'm not very sure whether she was pleased to see me or not at the time. But then I guess by nature Elspeth Hancock was naturally insouciant. But I was not to know that, and I did take things rather too personally. I remember thinking she had taken an instant dislike to me as her future daughter-in-law. I really wanted her to like me. When we drove up their grandiose driveway in a green leafy neighbourhood, where the houses made no apology for being opulent, as most of them were rather like palaces. I was certain Graham had taken the wrong turning in the road. There was no way his parents could live in an illustrious neighbourhood like this, unless they were actually made of money. I was about to express my reservations that he was going down the wrong way, when he simply parked his white SUV outside the stunning wrought-iron gate, and with his remote control, the gate just opened as if by magic. He turned around in the driver's seat to look directly at me. He grinned and said, "Ah, we're here." I remember gawking as we drove up the pristine driveway, with its manicured lawns and perfectly landscaped gardens, and I looked at Graham in astonishment and said, "Your parents live here? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Are they the Rockefellers or something?" My fiancé, immune to my astonishment, laughed and said, "You didn't think they lived in the stable block, did you?" I had thought his parents would have lived in a modest blonde brick bungalow or a double-storey wooden home, like the simple home I'd grown up in as a girl. But this I had not envisaged at all. I remember privately marvelling at this immodest mansion. So posh it was. It was seeping with the unabashful wealth of new money. My fiancé led me gently by the hand. He opened the door of this intimidating mansion with a spare key. The ornate door had been superbly handcrafted by a master craftsman, and it opened up onto magnificent sprawling white marble floors that extended from the vast foyer to other areas of the house, like a large river meandering into smaller tributaries. I observed a grandiose winding staircase with elaborate wrought-iron balustrades that swept elegantly up from the basement to the first and second floor. I noticed hanging above the staircase from a very high ceiling was the most exquisite crystal chandelier that I have ever beheld. There were stunning displays of artwork and sculptures sporadically dotted around the foyer. I felt as if I'd stepped into the pages of Hello magazine, where celebrities smile flirtatiously into the camera as they drape themselves decadently and rather extravagantly across glamorous furnishings, coquettishly teasing the camera with their choreographed poses, while the man of the house, wearing Wellington boots and a tweed jacket, enters the house with a golden retriever at his feet. It was that kind of house, which in that bewildering second had successfully stolen my breath away. It was almost as if I was having a bird's-eye view of one of the smaller palaces like St. James's or Clarence House. And yet my future fiancé had not cared to mention any of this to me. I now felt conspicuously underdressed in this stately home. I had asked Graham what I should wear. "Come as you are," he had chuckled. "You look fine in your jeans. There's absolutely no need to dress up for my parents. It's just Sunday lunch, for goodness sake. No one dresses up for Sunday lunch, do they?" "In a house like this, I think they do." I was now grinding my teeth in indignation. I was wearing dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, and felt significantly underdressed and daunted by the finery that surrounded me. I wanted to dash back home quickly and change into a ball gown at once. I'd seriously like the ground to swallow me whole. I'm about to tell Graham that I want to go back to the apartment as quickly as possible, to change into something much more suitable, when a tall, friendly man with dark hair and an olive complexion emerges through an arched doorway, with a broad beam on his face. He is very laid back, wearing a crisp cotton open shirt, and on seeing his son, he throws his arms around him, while Graham slaps his dad on the back. "Well, well, you've finally decided to grace us with your presence, have you, son? And who do we have here?" he says, studying me through curious green eyes. He lets out a whistle and then kisses me on both of my cheeks. "You must be Claudia. We've heard all about you, we have." "Well done, son," he says. "You've done incredibly well for yourself," he says, giving me a friendly but cheeky wink. "It's very, very nice to meet you, Claudia. Very nice to meet you. And I'm sure the wife will also be thrilled. Welcome to the Hancock family." "Hello, it's very nice to meet you, Mr. Hancock," I say, unable to suppress a giggle, as Graham's father oozes charm. "Call me Theo," he says. "Now where is that annoying wife of mine?" he says, looking over his shoulders. She always has a habit of disappearing when we have company. She can be as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel. Elspeth, Elspeth, he calls out. Graham and Claudia are here. Would you be so kind as to grace us with your presence? It must have been a moment or two later, when Elspeth Hancock, Graham's mother, my future mother-in-law, emerges from the back of the house. She is as thin as a beanpole, wearing an elegant pair of white cotton slacks and a silk navy shirt with white pearl buttons. She has grey hair that is cut in a pixie style, a Roman nose and a tight pointed chin, and what I would describe as brown hawk-like eyes. This is Graham's fiancée, Claudia, said Theo, smiling proudly, as Elspeth steps forward to shake my hand, which I notice to the touch is cold, hard, and brisk. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Hancock, I say bashfully, handing her the droopy daisies in my hand. Elspeth takes the flowers begrudgingly, as if I'm handing over a bag of my dog's poop. Oh dear, she says, glancing down at the daisies sorrowfully. They are almost dead, they are. You should take them back from where you bought them, my dear, she says, shaking her head sadly. It's criminal to sell flowers like this. I'm guessing you got them at a gas station. They've ripped you off. My bet is they won't last a day. Never you mind. Let's see if they'll revive in a vase of water with an aspirin in it. I personally find aspirin works wonders on drooping flowers, or lemonade. That also tends to help. I was mortified that she didn't even pretend to be grateful for the daisies. After all, isn't it the thought that actually counts? When I study Elspeth more closely, I realise she's a shrewdly practical woman, who, unlike a lot of wealthy women, does not wear lavish adornments or jewellery of any kind, nor does she get her nails manicured at a fancy salon. I did learn that she worked for local charities and helped people who were in dire straits financially, which made me like her a whole lot more. But right now, from where I'm standing, there's not actually a whole lot to like. Hello, she says to me. So you are Claudia, are you? My son has told me all about you. What could have possessed you, my dear, to want to marry my son? When she says this, I'm not sure whether she's joking or not, as her sombre face bears no hint of a smile. Ostensibly, as I sat at the table over a casual lunch, washed down with glasses of extravagant Bollinger, I was soon to learn that Mr. Hancock was actually a plastic surgeon. He'd made an extortionate amount of money for many years out of extravagantly expensive cosmetic procedures for women and men, which would explain his wealth. Your son told me you were a doctor, Mr. Hancock, I said, giving Graham a private glare. I got the impression you were just a GP, I'm afraid. Graham can be a bit vague. I had no idea you were a plastic surgeon. Wow, that's incredible. I am a surgeon, said Mr. Hancock. He talked about it as if he was talking about the kind of gas he filled his truck with. At first I was involved with cosmetic procedures mainly for women, and a scattering of men. It brought in a lot of dough, and was a highly lucrative business, he admitted, but it was so shallow. Elspeth here could not stand me pandering to the whims of the wealthy and the vain. I knew she was right, you know. I wanted to do something that really meant something with my life, if you know what I mean. So I ended up getting involved with helping people who had lost a face and needed reconstructive surgery, burn victims, people like that. And my life got a whole lot richer for it. Elspeth showed me what was important in the grand scheme of things, he said, reaching out lovingly to squeeze Elspeth's hands. This was the first time I'd actually seen Elspeth crack a smile. It was clear she loved her husband, if she was capable of loving anything at all, that is. He continued, You cannot believe the joy on people's faces when they are able to face society again with a brand new face, when their face was literally blown off by a petrol bomb or some other dreadful calamity. In a war-torn part of the world, many dreadful things happen to people, and some of the charities pay for these sorry souls to be flown over to America for reconstructive surgery, and then they return home with a brand new face. I deal with all kinds of reconstructive surgery. Putting people together again, I call it. I couldn't go back to bland cosmetic procedures, like facelifts and breast implants. It would bore the living hell out of me. Honestly, those procedures are seriously dull. I like to do something that's challenging, that makes a difference to people's lives. And the rewards, well, they're amazing. So gratifying they are. And you can never put a price on that when you give somebody their confidence back. My wife here spends a lot of time counselling many of these people who've been subject to some of these grievous injuries to help them get through their emotional trauma.
Wow, Mrs. Hancock, that's incredible, I said, turning to look at my soon-to-be mother-in-law, with a softer expression on my face, realizing that this cold fish of a woman might have some redeeming qualities after all, and her blood may not be quite so cold as I thought it was.
"Call me Elspeth," said Mrs. Hancock. "I do so loathe being called by my surname. It's so impersonal, I find. No, my husband is absolutely right. He has a very rewarding career, transforming people's lives, you know, making them regain their confidence. And it's a pleasure to counsel some of these people. You have no idea the level of gratitude they feel, because they've had life so desperately hard. I grew up in a very modest home myself, you know. My family never ever had much money. And it was the making of us. What do you do, Claudia, to give back to society yourself?" she asked me pointedly.
As Elspeth looked at me through shrewd, judgmental eyes, I said, "Well, you know, I try to be a good person. I mean, if I see someone in trouble, I might give them some of the loose change I have in my pocket. In that moment, I'm profoundly aware that I don't give very much to my fellow man, and I feel slightly ashamed, as if Elspeth has shown me up. I do love animals, though. I often give, you know, food and donations to shelters. I love our furry friends." I think my comment went down with Elspeth like a lead balloon. What did she expect me to say? She looked at me, and the corners of her mouth turned into a scowl, and she said, "Shame on you, Claudia. You can do a lot better than that. That's the problem with the younger generation, you know. So damn selfish. All you people want is handouts. Many of you young people do not know what it means to do a hard day's work. In my day, we worked our butts off, but the work ethics these days are deplorable. The people I meet from some of the most troubled parts of the globe know what suffering is all about. And do you know how incredibly grateful they are for the smallest favour? You have no idea. You've just had it so good." "Sweetheart," said Theo Hancock, "is it necessary to go there?" he said, raising a brow. "I'm sure that Claudia doesn't want to hear all about this. And I'm sure she does her bit for the community. It sounds like she's very generous towards our furry friends." "Just so you know, Claudia," said Mrs. Hancock, "don't think for a moment that me and my husband Theo, while we're on the subject of money and handouts, are going to be giving you any handouts in your marriage when the two of you tie the knot. You and my son Graham are both going to have to learn to make it on your own. I hope you understand that. Just because me and Theo are wealthy does not give my children, nor their spouses, a right to ask us to bail you out when things get tough. You two need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Because things will get tough, and they invariably do. But that is the beauty of life, and there are so many lessons to be learnt from that. And we would never want to deprive you of those lessons that really need to be learnt. I've seen what children are like when their parents give them far too much money. I see what it does to their personalities and their characters, and it's not good, believe me." "Of course, Mrs. Hancock. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm a freeloader, because that is not true," I said, unable to meet her fiery gaze. "I would never dream of asking you or your husband for handouts.
In fact, before I came to your house today, I had no idea you were so wealthy, because Graham didn't tell me that. I'm not interested in your son for his parents' money. That would be crazy. I may be many things, Mrs. Hancock, but I am not a gold digger." "Good, I'm glad to hear that, Claudia. I think I believe you. I really do. At least we know where we stand. But I would be incredibly grateful if you would call me Elspeth and not Mrs. Hancock. Well, I will just tell you for a fact that my daughter Simone is tirelessly asking me for money to fund her IVF treatments. The girl is desperate to have a baby, and she thinks that I should be the one forking out money for all her treatments. And I will not do it. Theo cannot bear to say no to any of our children. Subsequently, he paid for 3 of Simone's IVF treatments behind my back. And that cannot happen again," she said, giving Theo a withered glance. "I know you probably think I'm a tough old Washington housewife, Claudia. And in truth, I probably am. But I assure you that everything I do is for my children's best interests. The world, as I keep telling you, is a very tough place, and we all need to learn how to survive. What use are we if we can't survive in this world? My experience is when you throw money at your kids, they become dependent on you. The kindest thing I can do for my children, and you can do for yours when you have any, is to make them resourceful and independent enough to make their own money for themselves and to stand on their own 2 feet. That is the kindest thing you can do for any child." For a long while, there was a stiff, rather awkward silence around the table, until thankfully the conversation gradually lightened up considerably. But I realized Elspeth was a tough old bird, and this I had not expected to find in my mother-in-law. For she was a brusque woman, not afraid to express her opinions. She was likely to leave her entire fortune to an animal charity, rather than pass it on to her own children, I sneakily suspected. She wanted her children to work hard for a living, and not to rely on the benefits of generous inheritances. I remember on that trip back to our home, I cried the entire way, bawling my eyes out, telling my fiancé that his mother hated me. "No, she doesn't hate you. You've got that all wrong. My mother is like that with everyone. That is who she is. She can be as prickly as a cactus, I know. But if you know how to handle plants with thorns, you'll do just fine with my mother. But people that are thorny like briars can be lovable, you know. They can have their redeeming qualities. Because my mother, despite her idiosyncrasies, I wouldn't change her for the world. She might look as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, but my mother has got a heart for the underdog, you know. You heard her today, how she helps those whose lives have been touched by grave misfortune. And then you heard about my sister Simone. My sister has been struggling to get pregnant, and to no avail. She's been desperate. She's also struggling financially because her husband has made some lousy investments over the years, so they're having a rough time of it. And despite my parents' wealth, those 2 are not getting any handouts, believe me. My sister wants a baby, more than anything in the world, so Dad funded all her IVF treatments. But my mother went ballistic about the whole thing. She put a stop to it at once. You see, she had a tough life growing up. I know her family struggled to pay their bills. They had to think outside of the box to be more resourceful, to make ends meet. And my mother believes it was the making of her. She's tough with us because she believes being this way helps us to become more accomplished in life. She sees her hardline approach to us as being kind and loving." "I don't understand," I said. "This is her grandchild we're talking about. Why would your mother be so mean to her own daughter if she's struggling so hard to get pregnant? It makes no sense. You'd think she'd want to help poor Simone, if she's in the financial position to do so. In her shoes, I wouldn't hesitate to help my own daughter. if she did not have the funds to get pregnant. It's a human right to be able to procreate, surely.
My mother is an extremely complicated woman, Claudia. Difficult to understand, said Graham gingerly. She had a tough life, as I tell you, growing up. She does not believe in wrapping her own children in cotton wool. She doesn't believe she's doing us any favours if she does that. You mustn't get offended by her. As I keep telling you, she does have her heart in the right place, and many of the people she's helped speak so incredibly warmly of her.
Well, I don't like her at all, I spouted indignantly. If I had to choose a mother-in-law, she'd be the last person in the entire world I would ever choose. I'm sorry, Graham, I hate to say this to you, and I don't mean to cause offence, but your mother is awful, and I'm sorry, but that's what I think of her, and I'm going to say it.
Well, you're entitled to your opinion, and if you don't mind my saying, you seem as opinionated as my mother is. You might be surprised that sooner or later, one of these days, you could possibly get along. I'm sure you will warm to her eventually, said Graham kindly. I love the bones of my mother. I understand that everything she does is based on love. I think she is often misunderstood by people. I've just had an idea. Why don't you, when you go to the bridal appointment at the bridal shop to try on wedding dresses, your father is coming along to that appointment, and I hope you'll invite my sister Simone as well. But why don't you also invite my mother? If she realizes that you are reaching out to her and involving her in your special day, it might break the ice between the both of you. It's certainly worth a try.
I pulled a face. All right, I'll give it a go, but I don't think it will work. Your mother is as hard as nails. I was not certain that my fiancé's mother could ever be broken in. She was like a wild, unbridled mare that had a mind of her own, and I doubted she would ever transform herself into the perfect mother-in-law. But I could not give up on Elspeth, not just yet. I also needed to invite my fiancé's sister Simone to the bridal shop, as she was going to be our matron of honour at the wedding, and I wanted her to feel involved. If I could not get along with my mother-in-law, I had high hopes that at least me and my fiancé's sister could become bosom buddies. It was 2 days after our lunch at my in-laws that Graham introduced me to Simone and her husband Oliver at a bistro in town. Simone looked a lot like Theo Hancock. She had similar dark hair, greenish-brown eyes and olive skin. She was thin like her mother, and was wearing an elegant pair of pleated navy blue pants, a white cotton shirt, a blue blazer, and a flat pair of pumps on her feet. Her dark hair was swept back in a messy ponytail that she wore to one side, so that her little face with its high cheekbones was promptly accentuated. "Hello," she said, giving me a warm hug. "You must be Claudia. I'm Simone. This is my husband Oliver. My brothers told me all about you. Welcome to the family. We're a funny lot, we are, but I'm sure you'll fit in just fine with us." "I'm trying," I said, "but I think I made a bit of a bad impression on your mother." Simone pulled a face. "Don't you worry about my mother. She's not easy to win around, let me tell you. I know. I've been trying all my life, and I still haven't succeeded." And with that, everybody laughed, and I found myself feeling a whole lot better. Oliver was a thick-set man, with a large paunch that hung obtrusively over his trousers, that made him look like he was 9 months pregnant. He had several layers of pale pink flesh hanging under his jowls, and piggy eyes buried beneath the mounds of flesh. And when he talked, his face just jiggled, which I found oddly fascinating. He dressed like an absolute slob, with a shirt that was half hanging out of his pants, as if he couldn't be bothered to tuck it in, because it was like way too much effort on his part. His shirt looked like it was stained from some spilled pasta sauce on his collar. When he greeted me, he held my hand for far too long. It made my skin crawl to see the way he was looking at me. "You've done well for yourself, bro," he said to Graham, thumping him on the back. He had none of the charm that Theo Hancock had shown towards me.
"I would give her a 9,
said Oliver, running his eyes over me critically. He gave me a gormless grin.
"if your wife had a breast augmentation and her teeth veneered. I'd give her a 10,
he said. When I heard this evaluation of me, I wanted to throw up and be violently ill. This man was a grown-up, for goodness sake. He was not in junior high, hanging around the playground, rating the girls like some precocious little brat. I found myself warming to Simone at once, but I did not like the crude tactlessness of her husband Oliver. If I had thought Elspeth was opinionated, no one could be more brash and more outspoken than Oliver was. He literally had no boundaries at all. Why would such a nice girl end up with such a prize loser, I wondered, who only had one thing on his mind? Any time a woman entered the bistro, he was eyeing her up like a ravenous shark, and he ogled the waitress unapologetically in front of his own wife when she came to the table to take our order. He couldn't have been more brazen if he tried. I wanted to lean across the table and slap him across the face so hard so that more than the flesh on his jowls would jiggle. I wanted to tell him to get a grip, to stop drooling over the waitress, and to show his wife some respect. Simone did not appear to notice her husband's licentious appraisal of all things feminine, which I found astonishing and actually quite disturbing. I privately wondered if Simone deliberately turned a blind eye to her husband's flirtatious behaviour. Did she have any idea what her husband was really like? And did she really want to have children with a man like this, whom I was certain was not remotely faithful to her behind her back? Of this I had no doubt. "Are you planning to have any children when you get married?" Simone had asked me pointedly. It was clear that the subject of children was all that Simone ever thought about. "Well, we're not in any rush," I said, "but I guess if it happens, it happens. We'll go with the flow. We still need to get married first, and children can be put on the back burner for a while, can't they?" "That's what I thought," said Simone, "but I was a complete fool. I have an unfortunate condition, you know. I forget what they call it, but my eggs are as old as that of a 50-year-old woman, so they tend to disintegrate once they come in contact with the sperm. It's so devastating," she said, her face contorting into so many sad lines that I couldn't help feeling desperately sorry for her. It was clear she really wanted to have a baby.
"Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but there was nothing wrong with my apparatus," said Oliver smugly. "My fish, it appears, are all swimming in the right direction. It's the wife that's got all the problems in that department. I told her that from the very beginning. I don't want to be immodest, but it's true. When we went to have our fertility assessed, they were very impressed with the quality of my sperm. I knew the problem could not be mine. I told her as much, and of course I was right. I'm a sperm-making machine," he volunteered proudly. "There is no shortage of supply from my loins." "You do surprise me," I said. "I'd have thought a man like you would have microscopic sperm." For a moment there was an awkward silence around the table, and then Oliver laughed. "Great sense of humour your wife has, Graham. You've got a live wire here. But let me assure you, Claudia, there's nothing remotely microscopic about my sperm." "Glad to hear it," I said sarcastically. "Oh, I'm so sorry about your unfortunate, situation, Simone," I said sympathetically. "It is a real bummer. I did hear about the IVF treatments. I'm so sorry none of them have taken, but don't you dare give up. From what I've heard, science has moved on in leaps and bounds as far as fertility is concerned. I even heard that one day mothers can actually raise babies outside the womb, which I personally don't like. But what I'm trying to say, Simone, is I'm sure something will eventually work for you." "I'm not sure it will," said Oliver, butting into our conversation rudely, with the social grace of a rhinoceros. "You heard my wife. She's got decrepit eggs.
He snorted with laughter at this point, as if he thought his joke was hilariously funny.
"I've got the first-grade, top-quality sperm," he boasted, "while my wife's eggs need to be booking into retirement retreat, preferably with walking frames."
He chuckled again with laughter, and by this point I really wanted to slap the odorous creep. What on earth was Simone doing with such an uncouth man like this? "Well, it's not going to work. I can't have IVF treatments," said Simone gingerly. "No doubt you've met my mother. Well, she's the reason that I can't have any treatments. She put her foot down and has refused to let my dad give me any more money. At this rate, we won't have any kids." And with that, tears spilled down her cheeks.
"My parents are loaded. It's not Dad that's the problem. It's my mother. I hate her so much. She knows this means the world to me to have a baby. But she doesn't care a damn. She doesn't care."
"I'm sure she cares more than you know," I said, reaching out to squeeze Simone's hand. "You know, maybe she has her reasons for, not helping you out at the moment. Your brother was telling me she had a tough childhood." Simone made a pitiful face.
My mother, Claudia, she knows she can help me. She does. She is loaded. They both are. Both my parents are. She point-blank refuses to help me, even though this is going to be her grandchild. The IVF treatments are so expensive. There's no way that me and Oliver can afford them. And even after I had 3 sessions of 2 implanted fetuses, every session didn't take. Well, it did in the beginning. But after the 8-week mark, I lost the babies. It's been so devastating for me. You have no idea. And you know what? My mother has no sympathy whatsoever." "Let's hope the old bat dies," said Oliver. "Then we can get a hefty inheritance. When that happens, you can have 13 kids for all I care," said Oliver indiscreetly. I couldn't believe the tactless things Oliver was saying, and I didn't doubt he wished his mother-in-law was out of his way. He had that hungry look about him that affirmed to me he fancied having a cushioned life without having to lift a finger, and he had his ravenous eyes on his mother-in-law's inheritance, which was quite sickening. I couldn't help wondering at that moment if the reason that Elspeth had refused to support Simone was because she knew her daughter was married to a prize creep, and she likely didn't want her daughter having kids through IVF with such an unreliable father, who was more than likely cheating on her daughter behind her back. This was affirmed to me when we were leaving the bistro, when I suddenly realized I'd left my cashmere shawl behind at the restaurant, hanging on the chair. "You go back to the car," I told Graham, who was walking side by side with his sister, while apparently Oliver had to return to the restaurant to relieve himself. "I need to go back to get my shawl. I left it at the bistro." Who should I see draped over the reception desk, cheesily chatting up the waitress, but Oliver himself? The man had no moral compass whatsoever. "We could go out to a great restaurant," he was saying unabashedly to the waitress, throwing his card into her hands. "Give me a call." She was giggling coquettishly, flashing her long dark eyelashes at him. "What's in it for me?" she was asking. I didn't want to hear any more of this brazen conversation. Oliver was nothing short of disgusting. I crept clandestinely in the shadows, surreptitiously worming my way back to the table to retrieve my shawl. But all my worst fears about that lowering Casanova were confirmed. No wonder Elspeth did not want to support her daughter through IVF, I privately thought to myself. She had her reasons for not always being generous with her money. I was beginning to understand my future mother-in-law a little better. Maybe she wasn't all that bad, after all. Elspeth, 10 years before her death. Elspeth needed to get to the bridal shop to appraise some of the dresses that her future daughter-in-law Claudia would be trying on for her big day, to see which dress got the vote to be her bridal gown. She was already running late. She'd been dashing around the place like a chicken without a head,
dealing with all her charity work. There was so much to do, and frankly not enough time in the day to do it all. She had dropped off some much-needed groceries to a family in need that didn't have anything to eat in their cupboards, and the mother, after receiving her groceries, had hugged Elspeth, throwing her arms around the woman with tears pouring down her cheeks. She said to Elspeth, "You've saved my family. My children have been eating newspaper to keep their bellies full." "It's a pleasure," said Elspeth. "No one should be going hungry in modern-day America. It's absolutely disgusting. Please call me if you need anything else. Remember, I'm only a phone call away." Elspeth loved helping those Americans facing tough times in their lives, and this family was no exception. The parents were both middle-class Americans whom had fallen down on their luck. They were highly skilled. The father was an engineer and could not find work. Elspeth would try and pull some strings to help this poor family get back on their feet again. There were so many more valuable things that she could be doing with her time, rather than watching Claudia model a whole lot of dresses, which had about as much interest to her as watching paint dry. But she needed to show some kind of support to her future daughter-in-law, even if she had to do so rather begrudgingly. When Elspeth had met Claudia, she was exactly what she expected her daughter-in-law to be. Her son Graham had a predictable type, pretty, neurotic, and desperate to impress. The kind of girl that was born clever, attractive, and a little quirky. She had likely spent her life being adored by her parents, her friends, her teachers, and of course an entourage of male admirers. She'd have been good at absolutely everything. Definitely a teacher's pet, a school prefect perhaps, and a cheerleader without a doubt. Things came easily to people like Claudia, and for Elspeth, although she would have liked to have been happy for Claudia, she had seen too many girls from whom things did not come easy, and so she found girls like Claudia, who had it all, more than a little irritating. Elspeth had tried her best to be a good hostess when Claudia had come over for Sunday lunch that day, but a new person introduced to the family always took some adjusting for her. It took her a long while to warm up to a new arrival in the family. It was like introducing a new fish into the tank. It took a while for those new fish to fit in with the old ones. Elspeth hoped she would eventually warm to Claudia in due course, but she doubted that they would have very much in common. She knew that she had absolutely no time for Oliver, the lazy oaf that Simone, her daughter, was married to, who spent most of his time parked across the furniture watching reality television and investing in harebrained schemes that stole the couple's money, or, of course, lecherously ogling any woman that crossed his path. There was no way Elspeth was going to give her daughter money for IVF treatment. Did her daughter really not know her husband was cheating on her? How could she possibly pay for IVF treatments and have her future grandchildren raised in a dysfunctional family without a father? Sorry, but she couldn't do it, even if she was looking forward to be a grandmother one day. She was not going to finance a broken marriage. It was like putting money in a house that was not nestled on solid foundations. No one did that, for the house would crumble into dust, and good money would be thrown after bad. She did feel cruel turning Simone away from any financial support from IVF. Theo was begging her to change her mind, but sometimes you had to be cruel to be kind. Simone had turned around to her and said, "I hate you! I hate you! I hate you, Mum!" And those words had stung Elspeth to the core, for she had seen in her daughter's eyes a real hatred. She knew she was not desperately popular with both Oliver and her daughter, but she wasn't bothered about that. She knew what she was doing was the right thing. She was sure that Claudia had hoped she would be the kind of mother-in-law who fawned all over her, begging her to be best friends, shopping together and going to the spa. But that was never going to happen. Elspeth was happy if Claudia made Graham happy, and that they loved each other. After all, at the end of the day, wasn't that all that mattered? In Elspeth's experience, most parents wanted their children to be happy, but she wanted so much more for her children. She wanted them to be humble, contributing members of society, strong in the face of adversity, grateful in the face of misfortune, optimistic when life got you down, Elspeth had always wanted hardship for her kids, real honest hardship, challenges that would make them empathetic and wise. Elspeth had seen it enough in her line of work, with people who had been through unimaginable hardships, working very hard to support their families, and these people showed such gratitude and such courage. What more could Elspeth ever want for her kids? She had seen the way Claudia had looked at her. She knew what her future daughter-in-law considered her to be, cold and aloof, and maybe she was, but she cared passionately about her children, despite what anybody else might actually think. Elspeth arrives at the bridal shop a little late, receiving a few withered glances from Rhonda, the shop assistant, who runs the bridal shop, and her daughter Simone, who's rolling her eyes at the back of her head, and muttering under her breath, "So typical of Mum to be late." Elspeth sits down on a grand, over-the-top red and gold Louis XV upholstered armchair, angled towards the red velvety curtain. She is uncomfortably pretzeled between Claudia's father, who looks appropriately misty-eyed about the prospect of Claudia's forthcoming wedding, and her daughter Simone on the other side, who is sitting up rather stiffly.
"Are Mum and Dad ready?" asked Rhonda obsequiously. "Brace yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because your girl looks drop-dead gorgeous," she says, frog-marching Claudia onto a stage and pulling back the red velvet curtains to create maximum impact. Rhonda gets down on her hands and knees like a designer, adjusting the collection of dresses that Claudia is trying on to an appreciative audience. They're all very much alike, strapless and full-skirted, like one of those Barbies thrust into a girl's birthday cake. Elspeth draws in a deep breath. She's finding this bridal modelling show more than a little agonizing, but is trying to appear interested. She feels a tad annoyed that Rhonda, the shop assistant, keeps referring to her and Claudia's father as Mum and Dad. Elspeth had pointed out that she is not Claudia's mother, nor is she Rhonda's mother, but Rhonda seems to appear to be hard of hearing when it suits her. Elspeth has been surprised to be invited to these viewings, but she had cordially accepted the invitation from Claudia. I mean, what else could she do? "I'd really appreciate it if you'd come," Claudia had asked her bashfully. "It would mean a lot to me." Elspeth had found it hard to refuse such an eager, earnest request, even though she felt the whole affair was monstrously overindulgent. When Elspeth had got married, her mother had made her own wedding dress for her. In her opinion, the bridal shop is extravagantly over the top, but she wisely bites her lip and feigns an interest as Claudia models one dress after another. Finally, when Claudia comes onto the stage twirling around in a dress that she so obviously loves, she turns around to her father and says, "Dad, do you like it?" Her father stands up with misty eyes. "I love it, sweetheart. You look absolutely beautiful. Oh, my word, you really look magnificent,"
he says, pulling out a handkerchief from his tweed jacket and dabbing his eyes appropriately. "And you, Elspeth? What do you think?" asks Claudia, looking at Elspeth. Elspeth clears her throat awkwardly and says, "I think you look fine, quite fine," she repeats, privately thinking that Claudia looks forgettable, like a classic generic bride. "Mum," says Simone, turning around to look at her mother in horror. "Fine? How can you say Claudia looks fine? She looks absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. She looks incredible. That dress is absolutely amazing." "Good," said Rhonda, smiling broadly. "I think we can take it that Mum and Dad approve. I'll have you know," she says, turning to Simone, "fine is high praise indeed, isn't it, Mum?" she says, regarding Elspeth through cat-like eyes, as if daring her to say anything prejudicial against the dress that Claudia has clearly selected. Claudia strokes the dress lovingly, her eyes shining like rhinestone jewels, her skin flushing a bright pink. "I love this dress, Dad," says Claudia, swirling around and around in the bridal shop. "I love it."
"Well, then we must have it, must we not? Cinderella must go to the ball,"
says her father, smiling adoringly at his daughter and glancing towards the shop assistant.
"What is the damage, Rhonda?" he asks, clearing his throat.
Rhonda goes to her computer and taps away for a very long time, as if providing a price at a bridal store is hellishly complicated. It would seem that Claudia's prudent father is resolutely determined to foot the bill for the wedding, even though Elspeth had insisted on paying half. But Claudia's father is a staunch traditionalist, even though he only earns a modest income. Rhonda whispers an amount for the wedding dress, enough for a down payment on a house, and Claudia's father tries desperately not to look taken aback. He looks like a man who's been slapped across the face with a baseball bat, and is trying to find his bearings and to orientate himself. The colour drains from his face, and he goes an ashen colour. Claudia hurriedly steps forward and says to Rhonda, her face visibly downcast, "Are you sure the dress is that expensive? It's an awful lot." "I'm sorry, but it is that price, I'm afraid," said Rhonda unabashedly. "You see, we use real Schwarzkopf crystals in the dress. We don't skimp on all the details. That kind of thing is very important to us. It's like a ball gown, so it encompasses the use of a great deal of material, like Princess Diana's dress. Here, you know, at Princess Brides, we don't skimp on cost. We know that every bride deserves to be a princess on her big day." "I'm sorry, Rhonda, but I need to try on something a lot cheaper," says Claudia resolutely. "There is no way my dad can possibly pay a price like this for a wedding dress. It's ridiculously expensive." Rhonda appears to be pouting like a spoiled child. She raises a brow. "But this is your special day. Isn't that right, Mum and Dad? A bride deserves to be pampered, with no expense spared on her special day. I have a fabulous veil you can wear with that dress," she says, her eyes pinned on Claudia's father, who looks as if he's been backed into a corner. Claudia's father looks at his daughter lovingly and pulls out his wallet from his jacket.
"Is this the dress you want?"
he asks his daughter. "Dad, no, I can't," says Claudia. "I can't. It's a lot of money. Are you sure, Dad?" Rhonda circles like a voucher, presenting the veil, a brisk afterthought that cannot possibly be overlooked. "You need to take the veil with the dress. It's very important," she insists, tapping away at her computer friskily and throwing out another insane price that threatens to bring on a coronary arrest to poor Claudia's father, who looks like he might just faint.
"Of course we must take the veil as well," he agrees.
"Good! I'm pleased, because this is the last one we have in stock at the moment. The next shipment will be twice the price. You've got yourself quite the bargain here, because every bride has got to have a perfect wedding. Am I not right, Mum and Dad?" she says, looking at Elspeth, who is recoiling in disgust. Elspeth steps forward and does not hold back. "Frankly, I don't think anyone outside the ludicrously wealthy Rhonda would consider this a small price to pay for a wedding dress. And as for the veil, it is daylight robbery. That is what it is. Frankly, I'm disgusted and appalled. How can you sleep at night, girl, charging people this insane amount of money? I think it is absolutely disgusting." Everybody goes quiet in the bridal shop, as all eyes are pinned on Elspeth's remarks, while Rhonda's face has grown as red as a field of poppies.
"I'm afraid, Rhonda, you can forget about this transaction. My daughter-in-law does not need this wedding dress,"
said Elspeth fiercely, and with that she frog-marched everyone out of the store, looking more than a little confounded. But Elspeth can see relief all over Claudia's father's face. It was only in the years after this event that Claudia was privately able to conclude that Elspeth had been absolutely right about that wedding dress and its steep price that had been ludicrously over the top. In the end she'd worn a dress that she'd found at a department store that was so simple but absolutely beautiful, and she had never regretted that decision. Indeed, the simple dress, even Elspeth had admitted to her, was far more spectacular than the wedding dress she'd tried on in the bridal store.
"It's so much more individual, and so you," Elspeth had said. "It really becomes you, Claudia."
And for Elspeth to give anyone a compliment was a first.
"I'm glad you're marrying my son, Claudia. I realise that you've got a lot of grit, and I like that about you," she said.
Claudia's head had swollen with pride, and she realised in that moment she did, after all, like her idiosyncratic mother-in-law. Present-day Claudia. It had been a few days since Claudia and her husband had been visited at their home in Washington State by 2 police officers, and had been braced with the devastating news that Elspeth was now deceased, and she and her husband Graham and her 2 children were devastated to hear the fortuitous news. Elspeth was Claudia's mother-in-law, and her husband Graham's beloved mother. Claudia was surprised how attached she had grown to Elspeth over the last 10 years. The woman had proved to be indispensable when it came to helping her with her children. She had been a fabulous grandmother to them. At first she had thought Elspeth was as cold as a brass farthing, with the heart of a stuffed animal, but now she knew very differently. When the police had told the family that Elspeth had committed suicide in a small living room, as a bottle of tablets were lying next to her body, it had made no sense at all to the Hancocks, because they knew that Elspeth would never have taken her life. She and Graham had been confounded, staring at the officers in bewilderment with open mouths. Claudia did not believe for a second that Elspeth would do something like this. Something smelt off, even though the police claimed to have found a suicide note written by Elspeth in a kitchen drawer saying, "Sorry, but I couldn't go on. Please forgive me."
"There has to be some mistake," Graham had told the officers. "There must be. You have to know my mother Elspeth to know that something is seriously wrong here. My mother would never take her own life willingly. She was a tough old bird, she was. Nothing ever got her down."
"It's true, officers," I had told them. "There is no way Elspeth would take her life like this. It makes no sense at all. The woman was passionate about her charity work. She lived to help people down on their luck. She'd never deprive them of her help by ending her life like this. She would consider such actions incredibly selfish." The officers had glanced at each other in surprise. They hadn't expected this kind of reaction from Claudia and her husband.
"At this stage of our investigation, we are treating Elspeth's fortuitous death as a suicide, but we are still awaiting for an autopsy report from the medical examiner to affirm our findings."
Claudia had received a phone call from Simone, her sister-in-law, that had been also very bizarre. Over the last 10 years, Simone had become her very best friend. "My mother was in a dark place," she told Claudia. "She mentioned she didn't want to go on living any more because she was devastated about Dad's passing. But I don't understand, Simone," Claudia had said. "Your father died 5 years ago, for goodness sake. And now, after all this time, Elspeth suddenly decides to take her life. I'm sorry, but it doesn't make any sense, Simone. When did she say this to you? She never gave me the impression she was depressed." Simone suddenly sounded evasive. "Well, I went to see her, didn't I, the other day? She spoke about how sad she was feeling. But I'd rather not talk about it," said Simone, suddenly going very cagey. "But of course you don't want to talk about it," said Claudia. "This must be very upsetting for you, Simone. I am so sorry about your mother's death." Days later, Claudia and her husband Graham had been whisked to the police station. They were being ferried into different rooms in the station. She could see her sister-in-law Simone and that odious creep of her husband Oliver being frog-marched into separate interview rooms. Simone's face looked as white as a lily, and Oliver's face was red with indignation. Oliver was leering at an officer defiantly.
"What is all this about?" he protested indignantly. "Why are you separating us like this? I thought we were here to discuss my mother-in-law's autopsy report. But nothing about this interview looks benign to me. What the hell is going on here? You're treating us like criminals, and we've done nothing wrong."
Simone was trying to quieten her husband down, but he never listened to his wife. but appeared to be glowering at the officers like a rabid dog that would happily tear them apart, limb from limb, if given the chance.
We did not lie to you, sir. We are not misleading you. We are indeed going to tell you about the autopsy report from the medical examiner, said an officer. I'm afraid we have to follow police protocol. This is how we do things at the station. There are rules that need to be followed, I'm afraid.
Oliver's jowls were jiggling with indignation. In recent years Oliver had got significantly bigger, and his face resembled a hippopotamus.
I don't care whether this is police protocol or not, he snapped. Should I be calling my lawyer? I draw the line at being treated like a suspect. This is a goddamn joke. You hear that? A goddamn joke. And I'm not here to be bullied by you men.
Claudia perceived that Oliver was speaking sense. Why had they been whisked to the police station at once? One of the officers led her into an interview room. She suddenly felt very self-conscious, as if she was a criminal. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. Her fingers became all clammy and wet. She hesitantly sat on a hard, uncomfortable vinyl chair in the cold, nondescript police interrogation room, which certainly had about as much character as a blank sheet of cream paper. She found herself feeling decidedly nervous. She had seen these rooms before in movies, when people were being harshly interrogated. It occurred to her that she was a suspect. There was no way she had just been randomly drawn into this interrogation room just by chance. Then it hit her like an ice pick across the head. They hadn't been called to the station just to discuss an autopsy report. That was a crafty ruse to draw the close members of Elspeth's family to the station, like a truck of steers on their way to the slaughtering house, obliviously unaware of their impending fate. The police had brought them to the station nonchalantly, so that they would be unguarded, and then they would be separated on purpose to see if their testimonies aligned. This was a murder inquiry, and close family were like leading suspects, especially with a mother-in-law as wealthy as Elspeth. Claudia realized her mother-in-law must have been murdered, or even if she was not, the police were investigating this avenue of inquiry. She stared up at the camera in the corner of the room, tempted to wave at it. She was sure the police were watching her in another room, looking for any signs of duplicitous body language from her. She had known all along that Elspeth would never have committed suicide. It had made no sense at all. Of course Elspeth had been devastated when her husband Theo had died 5 years prior from a brain aneurysm. But Elspeth, although broken up, had picked up the pieces of her life and continued with things quite stoically. That was who she was, resourceful, brave, courageous. Claudia wondered why it had not occurred to her that her mother-in-law's death might have been more menacious, and that someone wanted her dead. But who? All these meddlesome thoughts whirled around her head like the clothes in a washing dryer. The police inspector finally entered the room, and gave her a brief cursory smile that did not appear to meet his eyes. He seemed brisk and businesslike in his manner, as if being friendly was an afterthought.
Hello, Mrs. Hancock. I'm Detective Hunter Parkinson, and for the record, I'm taping and recording this interview. Before we start, would you like anything to drink? A coffee? A cold drink, perhaps?
No, I'm absolutely fine, said Claudia. I want to know what this is about, Detective. What the hell is going on here? This isn't anything to do with an autopsy result. This is a murder inquiry, is it not? I'm not stupid, Detective. I can smell a rat. And for the record, I know for a fact that Elspeth would never, ever have committed suicide, so I suspect you're going to tell me she was murdered, and that I'm a suspect in your inquiries because I'm married to her son. It's no secret, Detective, that Elspeth was an incredibly wealthy woman. I imagine with her sizable inheritance that she's left her 2 kids very well provided for. So we're all suspects, all of us who are family members, because we have something to gain from her death. I've read enough detective novels, Detective, to know exactly how it works. The officer raised a silvery brow, and his blue eyes studied Claudia closely.
You're a shrewd woman, Mrs. Hancock. I'll give you that. I am impressed. You're a very forthright person, and feisty too. You seem very sure of this fact that your mother-in-law did not kill herself. You do know that there was a suicide letter found in her kitchen drawer. I'm sure you were informed of this.
Isn't that weird, officer? A suicide letter in a kitchen drawer? I mean, if I were to commit suicide, I'd leave the letter in close range of my body so everybody could see it, not bury it away clandestinely in a kitchen drawer. That is very odd, if you ask me.
You took the words out of my mouth, Mrs. Hancock. It is very weird indeed. Furthermore, I hasten to tell you, the handwriting on the suicide note did not match your mother-in-law's very distinctive curly writing. Someone made a lousy attempt to copy her handwriting. But our handwriting expert says somebody else wrote that note, and not very well either. It was not your mother-in-law who wrote it. But whoever wrote the note left behind no fingerprints on the paper.
So she didn't write the suicide note, Claudia gasped. So someone wanted her dead. They wanted to make it look like a suicide.
I'm afraid so, said the detective. Do you know who would want your mother-in-law dead? I want you to be very honest with me, Mrs. Hancock. It won't do you any good to try and protect someone in your family, even if you are closely related to them. It's always best to be completely honest.
Of course, detective. I'd never protect someone if they were responsible for Elspeth's murder.
Oh, but you would, Mrs. Hancock. I have a son myself, you know. If I suspected he'd killed someone, I'd try to protect him in any way I could. I'd fight his corner for him. It's human nature. But it's not right.
So from what you're saying, detective, you've established my mother-in-law was murdered. What was the cause of her death? I was told that pills were found in her body. I thought they said she'd overdosed on something. Are you saying someone forced her to swallow those pills at gunpoint? Is that what you're saying?
Before I answer your questions, Mrs. Hancock, I'd like you to answer some questions of your own. Can you tell me if anything looks suspicious in this photograph that I'm going to show you?
Claudia grimaced as the detective placed a photograph on the table. He turned it around to face her. She was certain she was going to see a picture of Elspeth's deceased body lying across the living room floor. Instead, she finds herself staring at a picture of the tiny living room, a small extension of the kitchen that Elspeth uses a lot in her home when entertaining her guests. It was ironic because she lived in a large, sprawling mansion, so Claudia found it always amusing that she used a tiny room when she brought friends and family for tea. "I'm just seeing a sofa," says Claudia, "and a window. It looks perfectly normal to me."
"Why, Mrs. Hancock, is there only one cushion on this sofa? What happened to the other one?"
Claudia stares at the photograph in surprise. The detective was absolutely right. "There are usually two cushions on that sofa. Maybe someone spilt red wine or juice on the cushion, so Elspeth sent it to the cleaners. That is a possibility, you know."
"It was missing from the living room, Mrs. Hancock. We made inquiries at your mother's local cleaners. No cushion covers were handed in by your mother-in-law for cleaning. I need to tell you, Mrs. Hancock, that on the autopsy report, green fibres, similar to the other cushion, were found in your mother-in-law's hands. Your mother-in-law had bruising around the mouth and nose. The coroner believes she was smothered to death. We believe the cushion on the sofa was used to kill her."
Claudia looked confounded. "You're joking, detective. Is this true? But what about the pills she was supposed to have taken? I was told they were found next to her body. Did you do a toxicology test?"
"You ask very good questions, Miss Hancock. For your information, the bottle of pills was crushed. It seems the pills were placed in your mother-in-law's mouth after death, but none of those pills were found in her bloodstream by toxicology. They were found in the mouth, of course. Your mother-in-law did not die from an overdose of pills. Someone went to great lengths to stage your mother-in-law's death, to make it look like a suicide, We are treating this investigation as a murder inquiry, and as you correctly point out, your husband, his sister, and her husband, and yourself, of course, are all people of interest in this investigation. I need to establish your alibis, to find out whereabouts you were around the time that Elspeth lost her life. This is very significant, Mrs. Hancock. If we can establish you have a solid alibi, we may be able to remove your name from our suspect list. Where were you between the hours of 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 7 p.m. at night?
I was at home taking care of the children.
Can you verify your alibi, Mrs. Hancock?
Well, June Peregrine came to visit me for tea at 3:30 that afternoon. She did leave at about 6.
And what about your husband, Mrs. Hancock? Where was he?
He wasn't feeling terribly well. He came home from work early. He went to lie down on his bed, but I believe June saw him when he came back home. She can verify that.
What time did he get home, Mrs. Hancock?
It was about 3:30, I think. You can check with his officers at what time he left. His secretary would probably be able to tell you. It would take 30 minutes from his work to get back home.
Are you sure your husband never left the house at any point when he returned home? Could he have slipped out without your knowing while you were entertaining your friend June?
He could have, Detective, but I'm pretty sure he did not. I don't understand why anyone would want to harm Elspeth, and Graham adored his mother, absolutely adored her. He'd never harm a hair on her head. She was a headstrong woman, you know, but I cannot believe anyone would want to harm her.
That's what we're trying to find out, Mrs. Hancock. You do know that your sister-in-law, Simone, and her husband Oliver, were the last people to have seen her alive. They popped over to her house when she was doing some yard work. They had lemonade and cheesecake with her. But they say they left the house, and when they did, she was very much alive. How is your sister-in-law's relationship with her mother, Mrs. Hancock?
It's quite good these days, actually. But they do have issues from time to time, of course.
Issues about what, Mrs. Hancock?
Well, money, of course. I mean, it's no secret that my mother-in-law is incredibly wealthy, and my sister-in-law has been desperate to get pregnant over the years. She and Oliver, well, they aren't exactly loaded. Theo, her father, before he died, paid for her to have IVF treatments, but Elspeth put a stop to all that. She said she was not going to support her having children in a relationship that was clearly not secure.
Why is the relationship not secure between your sister-in-law Simone and her husband Oliver? Asked the detective, looking curiously interested.
Well, it's no secret, Detective. He's a prize cad. Everybody knows that. My sister-in-law knows he's an insatiable cheat. He hooks up with girls on Tinder all the time for one-night stands. And Simone finds all the evidence of his indiscretions at the back of his truck. That always smells very strongly of woman's perfume, I have to say.
So your sister-in-law is aware of her husband's infidelity? Is that what you're telling me? And she puts up with it? Asked the detective, looking more than a little befuddled. Do they have an open marriage by any chance?
Absolutely not. I think that Oliver would freak out if Simone was to cheat on him. But she never ever would. She's hopelessly in love with the man. Personally, I think his face looks like that of a hippopotamus. But Simone, well, she thinks he's a demigod. And she's desperately afraid of losing him. So she puts up with all his nonsense.
I don't know how to phrase this delicately, Mrs. Hancock, but I need to say it nevertheless. Your sister-in-law Simone and her husband Oliver, do you think that they could be capable of harming your mother-in-law Elspeth over a financial dispute, perhaps? Before you get offended, I would like to remind you that many women can be driven to extremes if they rarely want a baby. And your mother-in-law not paying for IVF treatments for her daughter, when she could afford to do so, well, that might have been like a kick in the guts to Simone, don't you think?
Detective, I assure you, Simone could not harm a fly. And yes, her husband's a prize cad. But I don't think Oliver would harm Elspeth, even if she refused to financially help them out. They know what she's like. They have for years and years. I doubt they'd bother to even approach her for a loan.
When you are short of money, Mrs. Hancock, or when you're incredibly greedy, you can be driven to great desperation. Believe you me, many of the crimes I have investigated over the years have had a great deal to do with finances.
My sister-in-law and her husband are doing financially fine, Detective, as far as I know. I mean, he doesn't earn a fortune, Oliver, of course, but they can afford, to live well. Obviously, they can't afford the extravagance of IVF treatments, but that's a whole other story, isn't it?
The detective nodded. Well, not many people can afford those fertility clinics. They rob you blind, as far as I know.
Claudia nodded. It is ridiculous, she agreed. Poor Simone. She'd still love to have a baby. She's not too old for one. But I do agree with my mother-in-law, Detective. Well, my late mother-in-law, that is. I don't think that bringing a child into a fractured relationship is a good idea. And if your husband is cheating on you, then your relationship is definitely fractured. I've never told Simone that, of course. She's always thought her mother to be extremely unreasonable. But Elspeth was one of the wisest people I've ever known. She believed that struggle was good for the character, And in many ways I know exactly what she means. I've seen far too many people who've had life far too easy. And those people, they lack empathy and compassion.
I couldn't agree with you more, Mrs. Hancock. I've met such people myself. I am surprised your sister-in-law puts up with such nonsense from her husband. I think most women would be filing for divorce if they knew that their husbands were up to so much mischief.
Detective, I said, raising a brow, Simone is not like most women. You need to understand that. She's incredibly old-fashioned and refuses to hear a bad word said about Oliver.
It would seem you are right about that, Mrs. Hancock, and that is what worries me considerably. If you can think of anyone, Mrs. Hancock, who would have reason to harm your mother-in-law Elspeth, I would greatly appreciate it if you would give me a call at the station. As you correctly pointed out, in your mother-in-law's will it is her children and a charity that will gain a considerable amount of money in her inheritance. How are you and your husband's finances, Mrs. Hancock? I assure you appreciate that I need to ask these very awkward and uncomfortable questions.
But of course, Detective, I understand that I'm a suspect, as I do stand to gain from Elspeth's death. And believe it or not, I'd also like to find out who killed her. She was a good woman, Detective. She didn't deserve to die. In the beginning, I didn't particularly warm to her, but I soon realized that she had her heart in the right place. You asked me about my finances, Detective, when I'm quite sure you have copies of our bank statements. So you know that although we're not rich, we have savings, we pay our bills, and we're definitely not in debt, so we muddy along just fine.
You've got me, Mrs. Hancock, said the detective, flushing. You're a very shrewd woman, as I keep saying. Thank you very much for your time.
And with that he handed her his card, and Claudia walked away from the station to be joined by her husband, Simone and Graham. They all stared at each other in confoundment, with only one question on their minds. Who would want to kill Elspeth Hancock? Claudia's account. I was more than a little astonished to discover my mother-in-law Elspeth had been murdered. It seemed so surreal. I felt as if I'd been thrown onto a movie set and was caught up in some crime drama, of which I was playing an intrinsic role, as one of the key suspects. It had never crossed my mind that anyone could ever murder Elspeth. In my opinion, murder was not something I thought would ever cross the threshold of my own life. But how wrong I was about that. It can happen to anyone. In truth, the only people that would stand to gain from Elspeth's death were her own children and a local charity. And let's not kid, Elspeth was an incredibly wealthy woman, who had never been lavish with giving handouts to her own kids. Believe me, Simone had ranted with me enough over the years, about all this stuff about IVF treatment with her mother. She had confronted Elspeth, who had said to her,
"Simone, I won't be giving you any money for IVF treatments. I don't want to support you bringing a child into this world when you're married to a serial cheat. I'm sorry, but I just can't do it. Get rid of the man, and I will reevaluate my decision."
She had looked at her daughter earnestly and said,
"You want a baby, Simone? Listen to yourself. It's ridiculous. Your marriage is a joke. Everybody knows what Oliver is doing behind your back. It's going to look incredibly ridiculous if you have a baby on top of all this."
"I'm not worried," Simone had said. "I know Oliver will never ever leave me, Mum. He's committed to me and he'll be committed to the baby. He still loves me, you know. He just has a wandering eye, that's all. But it doesn't bother me."
"It doesn't bother you, Simone? Do you have any self-respect, young lady? You're happy to let your husband frolic around like this behind your back. Too right he'll never leave you, Elspeth. The man has about as much ambition as an upside-down sloth. He's waiting for a big payday to sort out all his problems for him. He's hanging on to the hope of a big inheritance from me, so that he never has to lift a finger again. And with a wife like you, letting him play around at will, he must be as happy as a pig in clover. I mean, honestly."
"But I love him, Mum," Simone had told her mother. "If I confront him about what he's done, he'll leave me, and it will be all over between us, and I can't let that happen."
"If he leaves you, Simone, it'll be the very best thing that has ever happened to you. That man has treated you like a piece of trash, and I simply cannot believe you're willing to put up with it. I raised you better than that, my girl."
I had told Simone that her mother was right, and that Oliver was indeed a prize jerk. But she refused to hear anything negative that me or her mother had to say about her husband Oliver. I'm not sure if she had abandonment issues or what her problem actually was. Maybe it was low self-esteem or something like that. But she professed to love the bones of her husband and seemed willing to overlook his indiscretions with other women, as if he was a dog that just couldn't help himself from lifting his leg up all over the furniture. That was when I realized that love can be very complicated indeed, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In the story of Shrek that my two children love and adore, Fiona is madly in love with a big ugly ogre, but I can understand and appreciate that love in every way, because Shrek was a lovable character, so much so that his physical imperfections were actually the making of him. But the hippopotamus-faced husband that Simone was in love with, dripping with the brazen infidelity of his licentious lifestyle, was far from attractive in my opinion. But Simone was seeing her husband very differently, from a lens that saw him in a more promising light, as if she was seeing him when he was at his freshman year in college, when he'd been a handsome-looking young man, and from that point on she had decided he was the one. I knew the story well. She had told me about it often enough. Simone had married Oliver when she was 22 years old. They'd been together for 15 long years, and now at 37 years old he was still promising her the world, that when he could afford it they'd try for several rounds of IVF treatments for her to get pregnant. Simone clung on to that lost hope, like someone who's been thrown a life raft when they're out at sea, and waiting for a rescue that might never ever come. After I married Graham, Simone and I became closer than sisters, and usually there was nothing she would not keep from me. But after Elspeth's fortuitous death and our recent interrogation at the police station, Simone had become increasingly subdued, and seemed to have severed all communication with me, which was so unlike her. It had been profoundly odd, but I persuaded myself she was grieving for Elspeth. Naturally, Elspeth's death had hit us all hard, and now that it had become a murder investigation, it was even harder to have to stomach. Graham confided in me that he had a hunch that Simone knew something about her mother's death.
"Did you not see how she was behaving when she was at the police station?"
he said to me in bed one night.
"I've never seen my sister look so scared. And as for Oliver, Well, he's behaved very insolently, hasn't he? As if he's got something to hide. You mark my words, Claudia. Simone knows something about my mother's death.
I'm sure that's not true, I insisted. She told me that her mother confided in her, that life got too much for her.
That's my point, said Graham. Why would she say such a thing to you? Especially now the police have established that her death was not a suicide. Have you noticed that Simone, who usually pops over to our house every day to see you, and to see the kids, has been unusually quiet of late?
Well, maybe she's just grievously upset about your mother's death. That's perfectly natural. She's probably locked herself away in her bedroom and is grieving. We all grieve in different ways, you know. Maybe Simone just needs her space. My husband sighed and said,
I hope you're right, Claudia, but I haven't got a good feeling about this whole wretched business, you know. And I am concerned that Oliver is behind my sister's insouciance. He controls her, and my guess is he's put a stop to her visits to our home. And the question is, why?
Oh, don't be ridiculous, I said. You're grasping at straws. One night something happened that turned my life upside down, because it opened a can of worms that I never saw coming, and the events of that night were profoundly bizarre. So much so that I'd be forced to ask myself years later, did that really happen? My husband and I had retired to bed. The house was steeped in a congenial silence. There was a pronounced nip in the air, as it was early autumn, and the countryside was richly ablaze with reds and golds that the month always invited. The household was still heavy with the loss of Elspeth hanging around our lives like a choker chain around our necks that was threatening to suck the life out of all of us. My family was grieving in different ways, and I knew my husband had taken his mother's death very, very badly. We all wanted answers as to what had happened to Elspeth, but I had an ominous clawing feeling in my gut that knowing the truth would be really unsettling. Naturally, we knew we were under investigation by the police. That was a given. But even with our somewhat loose alibis, they were sniffing around us like a hound after a fox's blood, and always randomly dropping over at the house to ask questions at the most inconvenient times, which I began to believe was by design. One of the detectives was constantly arriving at my house wearing a trench coat, even when the weather wasn't particularly cool. He would appear from nowhere, and then he would throw out all kinds of questions at me, like the darts being flung at a dartboard. He reminded me of that rather endearing 80s detective Columbo. He had this annoying ability to just arrive at the very moment when I was in a dreadful rush.
Oh, there you are, Mrs. Hancock. I'm so glad to bump into you again. I was just passing. I've got a few more questions I need to ask you,
he'd say, studying me through his brown hawk-like eyes. I was about to do a shop, detective.
Mrs. Hancock, I only need a moment of your time.
Well, you'd better come in, hadn't you, detective? I would say, leading him into the kitchen. And on our most recent rendezvous, he'd asked me all about my sister-in-law Simone. And far from occupying only a mere minute of my time, as he had promised, he left after 2 hours, having devoured an entire plateful of my children's brownies. These visits were becoming increasingly more regular. The detective knew that someone in our family was nursing a dark secret over my mother-in-law's death, and I think he thought that if he hammered away enough at the walls of our innocence, the cracks would begin to show, and his old-fashioned sleuthing techniques would be expeditiously fruitful.
I understand, Mrs. Hancock, that you and your sister-in-law Simone are very close,
he had said at his most recent visit. I recoiled when he mentioned Simone. I was naturally protective towards my close friend.
Does your sister-in-law Simone talk to you about her life with her husband Oliver? Are you aware of the financial struggles she's been having of late? Mrs. Hancock, you informed one of the detectives at the station that your mother-in-law refused to help your sister-in-law and her husband out financially when it came to IVF treatments, because your sister-in-law was very eager to get pregnant. She knew her mother could transform their lives if she was more generous.
Of course she was upset, detective. Did I not go into detail with the detective I spoke to about all this at the station? Must we go over the same old ground again and again, as if we're reenacting Groundhog Day? I appreciate that you're doing your job, detective, but these constant repetition of questions you've already asked me is doing my head in. As I told you, I'm sure she thought her mother was being unreasonable. She's been trying for a baby for the last 15 years with no joy. Her mother refused to support her. Simone was desperate to get pregnant, and Elspeth never paid for her to have any treatments, so of course it was distressing.
And why is that, Mrs. Hancock?
Asked the detective, his brown eyes growing sharp as he took a sip of his coffee, along with a large bite of his brownie. He watched me like a vulture hovering over a meaty carcass.
We have a saying back at the station, Mrs. Hancock, that greed and desperation can bring a good man down. I put it to you that with her mother out of the way, Simone would become a very wealthy woman indeed, and then she could have all the IVF treatments that she wanted.
Look, detective, I retorted, I know how it looks, but I assure you Simone was used to Elspeth refusing her financial help. She ceased asking her mother for help a long time ago. Her mother had a hard approach towards finances. Simone accepted that about her mother. Unfortunately, her husband is a lazy bugger. He makes bad investments, is often being laid off. So they have had some financial difficulties from time to time. But they muddy along as you do. And these days I think they've got their finances sorted out.
How do you know all this, Mrs. Hancock? If you don't mind my saying, you seem very well aware of your sister-in-law's financial state.
Well, I'm close to Simone, aren't I? If she is having financial issues, I'd know all about them. She doesn't keep stuff like that from me. She's an open book. We don't keep stuff from each other, detective. The detective raised a cynical brow.
You have spoken at length, Mrs. Hancock, of your brother-in-law's infidelity, and how your sister-in-law Simone conveniently turns a blind eye to it. I put it to you, Mrs. Hancock, that your sister-in-law Simone is putty in her husband's hands, and that she would do anything for him. Let's just say she's very malleable.
Where's this coming from, detective? I don't know what you're trying to suggest, but if you are daring to say that my sister-in-law would harm Elspeth, you're joking. You're absolutely joking. She isn't capable of that.
I thought you would say as much, said the detective,
sauntering off, leaving me feeling more than a little confounded. So on this unassuming, very ordinary night, as I'm lying in bed, a wind is whistling outside my bedroom window. The shutters are rattling. I feel cold, but I don't fancy getting out of bed to put on more clothes, so I cuddle up to the blankets tightly. My husband Graham is fast asleep. I can hear him snoring, and I feel envious of his ability to slip into the world of his dreams so seamlessly. I, on the other hand, struggle tirelessly to sleep when my mind is otherwise preoccupied with ominous thoughts, the silent whispers that keep nagging at my mind. I shut my eyelids as tightly as I can, willing myself to go to sleep, but I just can't. I can't get the detective's words out of my head.
It seems your sister-in-law will do anything for her husband.
The words leave me feeling very flustered and discomposed. I pondered over what he actually meant. Did he seriously think my sister-in-law Simone was connected to her own mother's death? Surely not. I sit up with a start in my bed and see my cell phone on the nightstand is flashing brightly in a green luminescence and is vibrating. I can see on the caller ID that it's Simone, my sister-in-law, who's calling me. Talk of the devil, I haven't spoken to her for ages. I'm thinking about her, and she suddenly rings. I glance at the time on my cell phone. You've got to be kidding me. She's phoning me at 4:45 in the morning. I instinctively sense that something is wrong. So I slip down the passageway so as not to disturb my husband, to talk to her. Simone, is everything all right? You're freaking me out calling me so early in the morning. No, everything is not all right, she tells me. I'm sitting in my SUV, parked outside your house. I need to talk to you, Claudia. We have to chat. Please don't wake up Graham or any of the kids. I need to talk to you alone. We can park the car. You can drive my car away from the house. On that sequestered country road, we can park there. We need to talk. Of course. I'm surprised. I'd never ever heard Simone's SUV driving down the driveway. I hadn't spoken to Simone for days, but I knew something was dreadfully wrong by the desperate tone in her voice. We had become very close over the years, so I knew when she was grievously upset about something, and at this God-forsaken hour of the morning she was more than just upset. I hurriedly put on some leggings, a sweater and some sneakers, and I discreetly descended the staircase. I opened the front door very carefully, and it nearly banged shut on its hinges, as I was eagerly embraced by huge gasps of hungry wind that beat fiercely against my face. Thankfully I stopped the door from doing much damage, and involuntarily waking up my entire household, which is the last thing Simone would want, as we did not need to alert everyone to our nocturnal activity that night. It was dark that night, but a pearly moon shone down upon me, subduing the darkness with its effusive light. There was a pronounced chill in the air, so I was ever so glad to be warmly dressed. I moved cautiously towards my sister-in-law's blue SUV, my sneakers grazing the moist trail of morning dew. I was greeted to the friendly sounds of the crickets and frogs. Sure enough, there was Simone, sitting in the front seat of her car, looking lost, forlorn and bedraggled. Her cheeks were puffy, her eyes pink, and her gaunt face looked all sunken and hollow, as if she had lost an extortionate amount of weight very rapidly. When she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks, and she climbed out of her SUV, asking me to drive in her place, so I happily obliged. I can't drive, I just can't. I'm in a terrible, terrible state. You certainly are. I mean, Simone, I've never seen you like this before. What on earth has happened to you? You look absolutely dreadful. I haven't managed to speak to you for days. You've been very, very quiet, and you've been avoiding all my telephone calls. You haven't returned one of them, and the only time I've seen you is at the police station, and you were as white as a sheet. What the hell is going on? That detective has been sniffing around me, asking me a plethora of questions, all centred around you and your husband Oliver, of course. I don't want to talk about it now, said Simone. Please drive. Let's park somewhere very quiet further down the country road, not too far from your house, and I'll tell you everything. I don't want to talk here, in case we wake up your husband and kids. We won't go far, I promise. Where is Oliver? I asked her suddenly. Does he know you've come out here in the middle of the night to visit me? No, he doesn't, and I don't want him to know. He's in bed, fast asleep. Well, at least I hope he is. He drank beer tonight. I hope to God he does not wake up and find I'm not there, because if he does, he'll kill me, quite literally. She looked at me with wide, scared eyes. He told me he doesn't want me to talk to you ever again. He's insisting that I stop being your friend and sever all communication with you. But how can I do that, Claudia? But you know what he's like. He can be very dominating. Of course I know what he's like. Oliver could be very, very controlling. But why on earth would he want Simone to sever all communication with me? That did not make any sense at all, unless he had something to hide, of course. Once I started up the engine, I discreetly drove away from our driveway. Then I took a long turn down the bumpy dirt road, only a stone's throw away from our house, fringed by thick forest on either side. And then I parked Simone's car on the side of the road, killing the engine. Now I need you to tell me everything, Simone. What is going on? I don't mean to be rude, but you look as if you've been run over by a bus. I've never seen you look like this before. What's all this nonsense about Oliver not wanting us to talk again? We're best friends, for goodness sake. Simone fiddled awkwardly with her string of Tiffany pearls, and looked up at me through sad eyes. There's stuff you don't know about, that I haven't told you, Claudia. I didn't want you or Graham to worry, but me and Oliver, we've been having some financial problems for quite a while. I haven't shared that with you, but things have been really, really bad. Me and Oliver, we're in serious debt, Claudia, which of course the police are very interested in. We've received a repossession notice from the bank, and we were about to be turfed out of our property. We were getting final warnings in the post. Oliver said we had to go and visit my mother at her house and ask her for financial help. Otherwise we'd both be homeless. It really was that bad. I'm not exaggerating. I told him my mother would never bail us out. She never has, and she never will. You know exactly what she's like. She's got strong views about that kind of thing. Oliver literally barked at me and said,
"You listen to me, Simone. You will persuade your mother to change her mind about giving you money. Won't you, Simone? I'm relying on you not to let me down."
I told him I would try my very best, that of course I would, to talk to her. But I warned him over and over again that my mother is mulishly stubborn. He told me that I didn't try hard enough to talk her around, that I needed to toughen up a bit and stand my ground, and then she would listen. We both arrived at my mother's house on the day she died, and found her in the yard cutting some roses to make an arrangement of flowers. She has an incredible rose garden, as you well know, and in her hand she had a pretty posy of mauve, pink, white, cream, yellow and pink roses. They smelt so fragrant and beautiful. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and was in a very good mood that day. She gave me an effusive hug, and you know my mother, she doesn't give hugs easily. But she was genuinely thrilled to see me. Oliver not so much, but then again she's never liked him very much, and has made no secret about how she feels about him to me. As I was saying, it was a warm day, and she said it was such a pleasure to have an impromptu visit like this from us. I felt rather guilty about that, because I knew we had an agenda in visiting her. The police know we visited her house because we knew better than to lie about such things to them.
"It is so wonderful to see you, Simone. What a pleasure. Let's go inside, shall we? It's a beautiful day. And have some lemonade. I don't know about you, but I'm very thirsty. Doing all that gardening work takes it out of you, you know."
She invited us into her favourite little sitting room and brought in from the kitchen long glasses of ice-cold lemonade, along with thick wedges of cheesecake that was absolutely delicious. She sat down opposite us very attentively and asked us how things were going with us. We engaged in supercilious small talk. You know how you do. My heart was pounding violently in my chest as I waited for the opportune moment to ask my mother for financial help, and I was very nervous about it. Oliver was making faces at me as if to say, "Speak to her now, for goodness sake." But I was waiting for the appropriate moment, and it never seemed to come. Oliver then became impatient with me and got quite brusque, and he said,
"For goodness sake, Simone, cut all the crap, will you? Tell your mother why we really are here."
My mother looked from me to Oliver and said, "Oh dear, I thought this was a friendly visit from you. Is something up? You better tell me about it, had you not?" That was when I said, "Mum, we're in trouble. We desperately need your help. We'll pay you back, I promise, when we get back on our feet. But our house is going to be repossessed by the bank. We need money desperately. We can't fix our problems without your help. Otherwise we're going to lose our home." She was silent for a moment and looked from me to Oliver and said,
"So you're expecting me to bail you out? Is that what this is all about? You know I can't do that. If you're homeless, Simone, you can move in with me for as long as you like. I'll welcome the company, until you get back on your feet, of course. I'm very sorry, Oliver, but I can't extend the same invitation to you. You will need to make your own arrangements. I know how you've treated my daughter, Oliver, over the years with contempt, so I'm afraid I cannot offer you the same hospitality, and I will not. But as for bailing you both out financially to save you from losing your home to the bank, no, I can't do that, I'm afraid. The both of you need to learn to take responsibility. This is a very valuable lesson for you to learn." "You heard your daughter, Elspeth. or are you deaf?" Oliver snapped at my mother. "She needs money. We need money. We're in a bad place. We are financially destitute. We are going to be homeless. You are stinking rich. You can help us. You're a miserly little bitch, Elspeth. You know you can help us, but you still refuse to. What is wrong with you?" My mother remained calm. She said to Oliver, "You heard me, Oliver. I'm not going to fix your problems for you. You forget I've also been in your position before. I've had issues with finances, and I had to make a plan. You need to do very much the same. If I were a bank manager, I'd not be throwing cash at you, and nor shall I, in the circumstances. It's a poor investment. That would be a foolish financial decision to make. The answer is no. I cannot and I will not help you out." There was a long silence for a moment, and I burst into tears, and Oliver said, "Look what you've done to your daughter. Look how upset she is. This is your fault, Elspeth, because you're as hard as nails. What kind of a mother are you?" "I think I'm quite a good mother, actually, even if I say so myself. Despite my money, my children are not self-entitled, mollycoddled, or spoilt. And believe me, it has been tough to say no to them. But it's been for their greatest good. But I wouldn't expect you to understand that, Oliver. I think you'll find all the problems you're having financially at the moment have a whole lot to do with some of the bad investments you've made, Oliver. And I understand you're not adverse to trying your hand at a bit of gambling. I suspect you've lost a lot of money going down that path. Now, as far as my daughter is concerned, she can stay here. No, but you? No, you can't. You're not welcome." "You're a bitch," Elspeth Oliver had snapped. "Your daughter needs help, and you refuse to budge." "I told you, Oliver, I can't keep repeating myself. If the ship you are on is sinking, you need to swim. That's what you need to do, and I'm willing to throw my daughter a life vest. She can stay here as long as she likes, but you're not welcome to join her, Oliver. I'm afraid I cannot condone your treatment of my daughter. You have abused her trust and mine with all your indiscretions. And if you don't think I know about them, believe me, I know all about them." "You're a bitch, Elspeth," Oliver had snapped. "Your daughter needs help, and you refuse to budge." "Oliver, I told you, my daughter can move in with me if she needs a roof over her head. I'm just not going to be throwing cash at you both. You both need to learn to face life's challenges without expecting handouts." "You should have seen Oliver," said Simone, turning to me with red eyes. "He was so angry, Claudia, so angry. He was like a pressure cooker that looked as if he was about to explode. I never knew he was capable of such rage. The next thing I know that Oliver gets up and he grabs the cushion on the settee and he throws my poor mother onto the floor, covering her mouth with a cushion to suffocate her, and he pushed down on her so hard. He was screaming, 'You bitch! You will pay for this!' I was terrified, begging him to stop, and I began throwing things at him, but he refused to listen to me. And it happened all so quickly. I couldn't stop him, Claudia. I really tried. And then I froze to the spot. It all just seemed so surreal. My mother fighting back, oscillating her arms and legs. And then suddenly her body, it just becomes just so limp. Oliver held the cushion down so hard to ensure she was dead. Oh, it was horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. There are no words, Claudia. I was in tears, shouting at my husband to stop. And I said, 'What have you done? You've killed my mother. How could you? This is my mother.' But he pushes me onto the floor so that I fall backwards next to my mother. And he screams at me, 'I'll smother you as well if you don't do what I say.' He made me wipe down the surfaces in the living room with bleach. He made me find some pills in the medicine cabinet, which I had to crush up with a pestle and mortar and put down my mother's throat. He then told me to write a suicide note, to leave it in the kitchen drawer for the cops to find. I promise you it freaked me the hell out. but I was so scared that Oliver would also turn on me. He became so manic, like a rabid dog, if you know what I mean. He told me, Claudia, that I should be grateful for what he'd done, that I should be grateful that he'd murdered my mother, because now Elspeth was dead, we would get out of our financial debts and would finally be rich when the inheritance came through for us. I promise you, Claudia, he had no remorse, absolutely no remorse for what he'd done. And I realized in that moment that my mother was right all along about Oliver. He wasn't a good person, Claudia. He never was a good person. I've not said anything because Oliver is threatening me. He says if I blab to anyone, especially to you, he will turn on me. He says he will tell the police I smothered my mother with the cushion because I was so mad that she wouldn't pay for IVF treatments. What am I going to do, Claudia? I'm in a mess. He doesn't want me to speak to you again because he's afraid I'll tell you everything.
Oh, my word. I don't know what to say, I said, sitting in the car staring out in the darkness on the road as I listened to my sister-in-law, unable to believe what she was telling me. So you're saying Oliver killed Elspeth? Where is he now? I asked her. I told you. He's at home in bed, she assured me. I slipped out when he was fast asleep. Believe me, Claudia, that man can sleep, especially after a couple of beers. I just needed to see you in person. I don't know what to do, Claudia. The police have been sniffing around us, and I don't think I can keep lying to them any longer. It's like they know we're hiding something. I feel as if I'm about to crack. And that detective, he's on to us, I'm telling you. This is not your fault, Simone. Get that out of your head. The only thing you're guilty of is being married to a monster. I've never liked your husband, Oliver. I always got the impression he was waiting for a big payday, so that when Elspeth passed away, he'd inherit all that money. I think she sensed this from the very beginning. Your mother was a discerning woman. I believe the only reason she didn't help you with IVF treatments financially was because your husband was such a rat, frolicking around all the time with other women. I think she knew any children you might have would grow up in an unstable environment. I'm going to be honest with you, Simone, but I don't think your husband ever loved you. I think he saw you as a meal ticket that was worth holding on to. But he's been cheating on you for years and years, and you have put up with it. What were you thinking? I never understood that. Most women I know would never tolerate that. But you put up with it despite knowing about all his indiscretions. And I just want to know why, Simone. I want to try and understand.
I don't understand myself either, Claudia. I wish I did. My mother's been telling me for years that my husband is a serial cheat. And you know what? I refused to listen to her, even though I absolutely knew it was true. But I just didn't want to listen. Sometimes you can live in denial, because it's so much easier that way. I used to discover lacy knickers in his car, women's lipsticks, all kind of stuff like that indicated to me he was less than faithful. But although I knew what was going on under my nose, I turned a blind eye to it.
Simone wiped away the tears from her eyes with a tissue and blew her nose into its folds.
I'm such a prize idiot, aren't I? What on earth is wrong with me? I tell you, Claudia, I don't understand myself. Why, I have absolutely no self-respect, no self-esteem. As you say, no other woman would have put up with this, but I did. What's wrong with me? He treated me with such a cavalier approach, and I put up with it all. I always felt if Oliver left me that I'd be all on my own, and that nobody would ever want me.
He didn't tell you that, did he? I gasped. You're a beautiful woman, Simone. Any man would be lucky to have you.
Well, he was always telling me how lucky I was to have him, and that other women would give their right arm to be with him. And I believed him, I guess.
Oh, my goodness. You didn't believe that, did you?
I did, Simone. Maybe I have issues with self-esteem, I'm not sure. But I really did think I loved him. But not any more.
Not after all this. And now he's threatening to kill me. He says if I breathe a word about what happened, that he'll do to me what he did to Elspeth, and I don't doubt he means it. He says I'm the weak link in the chain. I think he's afraid I'm going to talk. You could be in grievous danger, Simone, but at the moment Oliver needs you alive, because you stand to inherit your mother's fortune. Without you alive, there will be no money for Oliver. You need to go to the police and tell them exactly what you told me. I'm sure they will understand that you were afraid of Oliver, which was why you did his bidding, when you wrote the suicide note and crushed all those pills. I'm surprised you didn't realise that a dead body is not exactly going to assimilate pills after the body has shut down, and that the medical examiner would likely conclude that Elspeth had been suffocated. All of a sudden, we hear an ominous car engine approaching us. At first I thought my husband Graham had woken up, to find his side of the bed empty, and had gone out to look for me. But then I remembered my car was still in the parking lot. I realised by the distinctive familiar navy blue truck rolling towards us at a feisty, indignant speed that was going far too fast for a tumultuous dirt road like this, that this was no other than Simone's husband Oliver. And by the way he was driving, he was not a happy bunny. He drew up next to our car, killing his engine, keeping on his headlights that pierced through the darkness obtrusively. I watched in abject horror as Oliver climbed out of his car, slamming his car door behind him violently, and looking in at us through the car window with a murderous, very fearsome scowl on his face. I didn't know whether to drive away or to stand my ground. I felt every cell in my body prickling with terror, and I began to anchor myself to the car by clutching the steering wheel as tightly as I could, so much so that my knuckles began to show through the skin. I decided to stay stoically parked in the road. It would be better to appear that I had no knowledge of what Oliver had done to Elspeth. If I drove away, it would be blindingly obvious that I knew the truth about the murder, and put me and Simone in greater jeopardy. So I steadfastly remained seated in the car, trying desperately to appear nonchalant and relaxed, as if it was perfectly normal to have a chinwag with Simone at such an early hour of the morning. I couldn't let Oliver see that beneath the very aloof veneer that I was projecting, that I was a bundle of nerves, and my heart was leapfrogging in my chest, my stomach recoiling in trepidation. He thundered towards us, with a face as black as a thundercloud.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
He was screaming at Simone, banging on the window. I wound down my window and said, "Oliver, it might be nice if you actually said hello. Why are you in such a capricious mood? I mean, you really got out of the wrong side of the bed, didn't you?"
Why am I in such a capricious mood? Are you joking, Claudia? That's rich coming from you. I'd think that was blindingly obvious. I'll tell you why I'm in a capricious mood. I wake up in bed to discover my wife has slipped out of her bed in the middle of the night without telling me where she's going. And then here you are, the both of you, having a nice cosy chat together at this insane hour of the night on a sequestered country road. What am I supposed to think? It was lucky I spotted you here when I was about to turn down your driveway, Claudia. I knew at once that Simone had come running to you, Claudia. My wife is so predictable. She's like a pane of glass. You can see through her. If she wants to talk, she can talk to me. What is a man supposed to think?
He cocked his head at a strange angle, studying us curiously. I guess he was trying to figure out whether Simone had confided in me or not about the murder, and how he'd killed Elspeth Hancock. I felt very uncomfortable as Oliver scrutinized me. My cheeks were burning. I could feel the fire of this heat rising up from my chest, and sensed sweat was breaking out on my hands and back, something that has never happened to me before or since. My mind was screaming, "Stay calm, Claudia. If Oliver knows you know what he did to Elspeth, your life could be in perilous danger. If he killed Elspeth, he won't hesitate to kill you." "I'm so sorry, Oliver. I did suggest that Simone phoned you to let you know her whereabouts, in case you got worried, but she insisted you were a deep sleeper. She didn't want to wake you up. She's grieving the loss of her mother, and wanted a girly chat with me, that's all. We're talking about Elspeth, how much we miss her. It was my suggestion we parked further down the road away from the house. I didn't want to wake up my husband either, nor the kids, of course. This time it was Oliver's face that turned as red as a field of poppies, and even in the moonlight I could see that clearly.
If you wanted to talk, Simone, you could have talked to me about Elspeth, instead of coming here in the middle of the night so clandestinely to talk to Claudia about your mother. It's ridiculous getting out of your bed in the middle of the night like this.
He growled contemptuously, his piggy blue eyes glowering at his wife through the ubiquitous folds of flesh that gathered around his face and under his jowls like a turkey's neck.
You need to get out of the car now and come home with me, Simone. Right now, he ordered. Your behaviour tonight has been insane.
To be fair, Oliver, I said, Simone is very upset about her mother's passing. It's perfectly understandable. She couldn't get to sleep. She wanted to talk to me about her mother. She needed a female companion. I'm sure you must appreciate that. Please don't be too hard on her, Oliver. We all grieve in different ways.
Quit making excuses for my wife, Claudia. You're well-meaning, I know, but keep your nose out of our business, will you? Now get out of the car, Simone. I'm taking you home.
I don't want to come with you, said Simone, trembling. I want to stay here with Claudia. Why don't you go away and leave me alone? She said, her eyes brimming with tears. You're such a bully, Oliver, and I'm tired of being ordered around by you. This is my life. If I want to speak to Claudia, it's my business what I do. It's got nothing to do with you. Please go away, will you? I'll be back later in my car, I promise. Just give me some space, will you? I realized Simone looked frightened. Maybe she was scared that if she returned home, that her husband might find out what she had told me, and that I knew the truth about what had happened to Elspeth, and there would be less than favourable consequences when he learnt that his wife had betrayed his trust. Oliver was now seething.
You're going to come with me now, Simone. Do you understand? Claudia can drive your car back to her house, and in the morning we'll pick your car up. Do you understand?
I'm not coming with you, Oliver. I'm staying here. You can't force me to do anything I don't want to do, she said indignantly.
I see what this is all about. You've told Claudia, haven't you?
Oliver growled.
You've told her, you idiot. I told you to keep your mouth shut. You're a liability, that's what you are.
She won't tell anyone, will you, Claudia? Said Simone, looking at me pleadingly. No, of course I won't say a thing. Your secret's safe with me, Oliver. I won't breathe a word, I promise.
You idiot, Simone. Look what you've done. Of course Claudia will blab. She's a liability. Get out of the car now, he shrieked at his wife.
She trembled violently, reluctantly opening the passenger side door, fear pooling in her eyes. He dragged her aggressively out of the car, throwing her roughly off her feet, so she staggered precariously, falling backwards on the ground and wincing in pain. To my horror, Oliver leaned over towards me on the car seat. He'd pulled something out from the side of his belt, and I realized to my astonishment it was a revolver. I could not believe that this was happening to me. Surely not. It seemed so surreal. This sort of thing happened in the movies, but not in real life. Surely not. I willed myself to believe it was all an illusory dream, shutting my eyes as tightly as I could, to block out the reality of this indelible traumatic moment. Oliver's voice threw me out of my denial, as if I'd been flung from the ground into the crashy, thunderous water of an icy cold ocean, and was being threshed around violently by the waves.
Any last words, Claudia?
He asked me, placing the revolver at my temple. I'd never known Oliver to carry a weapon on his person before, but tonight he meant business. I could see the resolute determination in his blue eyes. He was going to kill me in any second. and the moment seemed to last for a lifetime. My whole body froze like a large block of ice, and I knew that my life was over. The barrel of the gun was so cold and hard on my skin. I was poignantly aware that I was seconds away from being thrown into oblivion. "Please don't, Oliver. You really don't need to do this. I promise you I won't tell the police a thing. I'll keep Storm. I won't betray your trust. You're part of the family. Families stick together, don't they?"
"Claudia, don't start playing games with me. Do I look like an idiot? You've never liked me. You are a danger to me, a threat thanks to my wife. And I'm not going to prison on account of you. You can bet your bottom dollar about that."
I stared at the revolver incredulously. I waited for my head to explode. There was no point in fighting back. I'd seen enough horror movies to know one shot to the head, and it would all be over for me. Thank God it would be quick, and I would be spared any suffering. But I really did not want to die. I had children that needed me, and a life that still needed to be lived. But there was no reasoning with a manic man like Oliver. I remember that time. It just stood still, as if I was holding an elastic band back, as wide as I possibly could, to prolong the agony. But when the elastic band snapped, it would all come to an end. I watched as Oliver pulled the trigger, but it didn't fire. He tried again and again, and I realized the barrel was empty. He cursed under his breath furiously.
That bitch! That bitch! She took the bullets out of my revolver,"
he growled. I was to learn that it was very shrewd thinking on Simone's part when she had clandestinely removed all the bullets from her husband's gun, for she feared her own life might be in mortal jeopardy, and was grievously concerned it might well be used against her, now that she knew what her husband was capable of. Simone screamed out to me, "Run, Claudia, run! He's still going to kill you! You need to get away! Go into the woods!" I managed to open the car door, and I hightailed it through the woods, my body quivering like a jelly. I then heard Simone crying out, and I suspected that Oliver had ruthlessly lashed out at her. She was crying, "Please don't! Please don't, Oliver! Don't kill Claudia! You can't kill her! Leave her be! I know she won't tell the police about what you did, but please, I beg you, don't hurt her!"
"This is all your fault, Simone. If you hadn't blabbed like you did, Simone would be in one piece. But now she's a dead woman thanks to you. You have killed her. I warned you about this, but would you listen? No, you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't. That's too much."
"Please, Oliver, don't do anything stupid," came her desperate cries. "I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to tell her." I heard him swearing at his wife, and then it became very silent, ominously quiet, so much so that for a moment I wondered if Simone was actually dead. It turned out he'd knocked her out cold, so she couldn't call the police while he was in hot pursuit of me. He'd deal with her later by using his masterful manipulative tactics to keep his wife's mouth firmly shut. Right now his prime focus was to get me. He was determined to kill me in order to shut me up, and that was exactly what he intended to do. The man was unfit, but at 6 foot tall and over 300 pounds, he was strong, and I was no match for someone of his size. At least I had a fighting chance of getting away from Oliver. It was so dark and gloomy in the woods, and I was afraid of falling and tripping over forest debris that I couldn't see clearly, or large formidable dips in the ground, or worse still, gnarled roots that trespassed obtrusively through the earthen floor, like clandestine animal traps that were resolutely determined to bring me to my knees, as they could so easily throw me off my feet and twist an ankle if I wasn't paying close attention. I couldn't afford to allow that to happen, or I would be a sitting duck for Oliver. I had no torch with me, nor did I carry on my person a cell phone, which was most unfortunate, I realised that I'd foolishly left it on the side table while unlatching the front door to get to Simone. Simone's visit had been so last minute, I had overlooked such considerations. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, and it was like running through the woods with a blindfold over my eyes, as the trees stood together like an army battalion, and the deciduous trees that stood among the evergreens stretched out their boughs so wide, as if determined to block out any moonlight. So the forest had become a tenebrific labyrinth of trees. I began to run as fast as I possibly could, but I was often forced to slow down to a snail's pace when the darkness was so densely thick that I couldn't see anything at all. The soles of my sneakers were kicking up dirt and fallen leaves. My heart was heavy as it thundered violently in my chest. Every beat was so loud, I was sure the whole forest could hear it, and most especially Oliver, whose threat loomed over me the closer he got to me. I could hear his heavy boots pounding the forest floor, and I knew he was gaining fast ground on me, and that he clearly had a flashlight with him, so he had a huge advantage over me. A voice in my head kept persuading me to keep running, but my flailing legs felt like cement beneath me, and I felt as if my strength was waning, like that of a dying bird. I had come so close to losing my life. If there had been a bullet in that barrel, I would be dead by now. It made me feel violently sick, as bitter bile rose up in the back of my throat, and for a brief moment the nausea slowed me down, and I thought I would heave and deliver the contents of my stomach over a bush or two. Even though I couldn't see where I was going, I had to keep moving steadily forward. I could make out the lofty silhouettes of the trees from time to time, when a soft trickle of moonlight suddenly bounced through the trees, and I was so grateful for that. I navigated my way through the trails, more from instinct than anything else. I could hear the sounds of the crickets and frogs, and the odd howl of a coyote and the hoot of an owl. But I continued to run, because I needed to get out of here as fast as I could. But the trees seemed to go on forever and ever, and I had no concept of where I was going. I felt so terribly lost, so confused, so disorientated. Then I heard the unwelcome sound of Oliver's booming voice, and the tread of his heavy boots thundering through the forest, getting closer and closer and closer, so that I could sense it wouldn't be long before the man was breathing down my neck like a dragon, with his vaporous breath that I'd noticed had smelt strongly of booze when I'd been talking to him moments before. I'm sure he had drunk way more than just a couple of beers, as Simone had implied, but he could hold his alcohol better than most. In the distance I could see the flash of his light that was so powerful it lit up all the trees. I looked around the forest floor for anything that could protect me, anything that could potentially save my life. I managed to find a long, very solid piece of timber that would be a useful weapon. If I was going to die, I'd put up a fight and hit him as hard as I could, aiming for the groin and the head. But if the worst came to the very worst, I would scratch Oliver as hard as I could, leaving skin cells under my nails for DNA evidence, because when push came to shove, he was not going to get away with this. Oliver's voice echoed through the woods as he got closer and closer, and I knew the only thing I could do was to hide in the obscure shadows. So I quickly took cover behind a tree and stood very still, hardly daring to breathe, as Oliver neared his approach, and was so uncomfortably close I could potentially have almost reached out to touch him. I was certain he was going to see me, as he had a powerful torch in his hands, which he was shining through the trees, and he knew, in this dark clawing abyss that had expunged all the light, soaking it up like a sea sponge, he would know, with a salient confidence, that I would not have got very far in my journey through the trees. In a trice, the darkness was suddenly vanquished by the brazen light of his intrusive torch. If I moved an inch, or dared to cough or sneeze, I'd give myself away. and I couldn't believe it because I had a tickle at the back of my throat, and I was desperate to sneeze, and it was so hard to restrain myself from just letting go. But I managed to hold that sneeze in. I was gripping onto the piece of timber so hard, ready to launch an attack on Oliver, if needs must.
You cannot have got very far, Claudia, without any light in here. It's very dark. You might as well give yourself up, because I'm going to find you. And when I do, it's over cadovers for you. You see, Claudia, I know your type well. I've never liked you, you know. Never seen what my wife saw in you. You're not like Simone. She's easily controlled. You are like a hand grenade, and that's a big problem for me. Women like you are a liability. You're like an untamed wildfire that needs to be put out, or there's problems.
My mind was doing somersaults as thoughts whirled around my head frantically. He's going to find you, Claudia, and he's going to kill you. He's going to make it look like an accident. Maybe he'll bury you, and you'll never be found. And your disappearance will make the police think you killed Elspeth and ran away to avoid conviction. Because I knew Oliver was clever. He could make an accident look like a suicide, or he could make a disappearance look like a guilty conscience. I was hiding behind a large tree trunk, watching Oliver moving through the trees, casting his obtrusive light over everything. He was getting closer, and this time he was too close. I could actually see his breath coming out of his mouth. I was tempted to run, but if I did so, he'd catch up with me. He'd throw me violently to the ground. My best chance of survival was to remain very, very still. All of a sudden, someone was tapping me gently, but it wasn't Oliver, as I could see this very distinctive, ungainly shape looming behind me in the trees. For a moment, I thought it was Simone. I turned around, and that was when I saw him. I recognized him at once. The Bigfoot I'd seen from my kitchen window almost every night when I was washing the dishes at my sink. I wasn't afraid seeing the Bigfoot, as it was like seeing the jaws of life when you're lying within the folds of metal after a devastating accident in your car, and your life is precariously hanging in the balance and ticking away. What I did next surprised even me. I grabbed the Bigfoot by the hair on his arm and pointed into the woods towards Oliver, who was only feet away from me, his back facing away from me. The Bigfoot's yellow eyes looked down on mine, and I looked up into his. I had to crane my head because he was so terribly tall. At a guess, I would say he was easily 8 foot tall or even more. He had a very distinctive face that was so human-looking. I noticed he had a slight jagged scar on his cheeks, and he had heavily furrowed forehead and a bit of white hair on the lower neck, like you often see in dogs and cats, although he didn't have much of a neck at all. I noticed his hair was very long and silky, and in the dark shadows it looked black, although as to the exact shade it was, I couldn't be sure. He could have been a dark brown colour for all I knew. I could see him so clearly, because the light of Oliver's torch had illuminated the entire woodgrove. I wanted to speak to him, but I was held hostage to my fear, as coming so close to death had derailed me, which was a joke in the circumstances, as I should have been terrified of the Bigfoot. But I knew instinctively he imposed no threat to me at all. It is hard, if not impossible, to explain, but the Bigfoot was gentle and benevolent towards me, which certainly contradicts stories I've heard of Bigfoot encounters that have been dangerously threatening. This Bigfoot wore his heart on his sleeve, and I have never beheld a greater kindness than the kindness I saw in his dark eyes, and I suddenly felt swaddled by the safety that he cocooned me in, by just physically being in his presence. Relief washed over me, like the warm waves baptizing my feet on the seashore. I observed that the Bigfoot physically frowned as he studied Oliver through narrowing hooded eyes. Oliver trudged further away from us, scanning the grove with the piercing light of his torch. The lines on the Bigfoot's forehead began to furrow in perplexement. He looked almost like a police dog, the way he was watching Oliver so attentively, as if his ears were perking up, and he was listening to every single sound that Oliver was making. He was incredibly alert, and paying close attention to Oliver's every move. He glanced at me briefly, looking into my eyes. I desperately tried to communicate with him. I opened and closed my mouth, but I felt as if my vocal cords were severed, as nothing came out of my mouth. But in my mind I was saying, "Help! Please help! He's going to kill me! Please help!" To my amazement, words came back into my head that were not my own. I knew they were coming from the Bigfoot.
"Don't you worry. I will eliminate the problem for you. I knew he was up to no good. You look terribly frightened. Just you stay there."
I was gobsmacked. I had communicated telepathically with the Bigfoot. Had that really just happened? It seemed so far-fetched, so unbelievable, so surreal. But I felt like he was my friend, and he was going to help me. Suddenly I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to be safe, and I stood watching behind the tree to see what would happen next. This Bigfoot was so incredibly intimidating. I knew that Oliver would be absolutely petrified to encounter this beast. For a moment, the Bigfoot stood very still behind the tree, watching Oliver. And I think Oliver must have sensed his presence or that he was being watched, because he kept looking nervously behind him. I was sure the Bigfoot would scare him off, and then I would get back home safely to call the police. But that is not what happened. When the Bigfoot said he'd eliminate the problem, he meant it literally, as I imagine his word elimination means just that. The Bigfoot moved stealthily towards Oliver, but Oliver did not see him at first, with the blazing light of his torch. But he did appear to sense something, because he suddenly looked very, very nervous. He started to tremble a bit awkwardly, and he kept looking around him suspiciously. I suspect he could feel the formidable presence of the Bigfoot, but he could see nothing, even though the Bigfoot was a hair's breadth away from him. He was hurriedly shining his torch through every nook and cranny in the woodgrove, but he continued to see nothing, until finally his light landed on the Bigfoot. For a moment I don't think he could believe what he was actually seeing, because his torchlight lit up the Bigfoot and the light cascaded over his gargantuan form. Oliver let out a loud gasp. He was horrified when he saw the Bigfoot. His eyes widened in terror, his mouth opening and closing. He then retracted his torch, as if he doubted what he'd actually physically seen, only to return his torchlight, to shine it blazingly on the creature again. At this point I think it hit him like a brick over the head, that what he was perceiving was actually real, not a mere figment of his imagination, or a dark ambiguous shadow he thought looked like a monster. He must have realized in abject horror that the daunting, imposing, gargantuan figure standing before him was a Bigfoot, and he imposed a deadly threat. I hoped for a moment he was seeing his life flash before him, like I had done when he placed the barrel of the gun on my temple. The Bigfoot was standing very, very still, not moving an inch. He was like a tree trunk, and you might have suspected as much if your eyes had scanned past him. But he appeared to be studying Oliver closely, almost as if looking through a glass pane. Oliver stared at him and screamed in rapid succession, and then he began to run as fast as he could. He was breathing furiously, running through the woods like a bat out of hell, whimpering all the way like a crying child. The Bigfoot seemed to be deliberately allowing him to get ahead. And then in a few large strides he caught up with Oliver, grabbing him by the legs, dragging him across the forest floor. He was kicking and screaming and crying out for help, but no one came to his aid, and his body continued to be dragged along the ground, and was being violently grazed by the intrusive rocks, roots, and ferns that crossed his path. He continued to scream in terror, and that scream still haunts my darkest nightmares, for I have never heard anything like it, even in a movie. I stood there very still, watching in awe, feeling a certain amount of satisfaction that the man who had put a gun to my temple moments before was getting exactly what he deserved. I hoped he was terrified out of his wits. The Bigfoot put him out of his misery so fast. He leant over him and just snapped his head like that, with a loud click. I could see Oliver lying on the ground, his eyes glazed over like a dead fish, his mouth wide open. For a while I just stood there staring at the Bigfoot in bemusement, as he stared back at me.
Anginatuan, tola bishakikwa. He was a bad, bad man, he said to me. Helan takwani. I eliminated him for you.
I ran over to the Bigfoot and threw my arms around him, although my arms were so small and so fragile in his. I couldn't even reach very far. But he grabbed me gently, put me on his lap like a little girl, and rocked me. I burst into tears. I cried and cried, sobbing in his chest, so that my tears actually wet his hair.
Tilatua, Bakila solo. He's gone. He cannot hurt you now, the Bigfoot told me. Helatiswana. I won't let anyone hurt you. Holatila pokosha. I watch your family every night. Holotona. You see me from your window, do you not? Kila tikana kwasika. I guard these woods, even from some of my own kind, and I guard all who live in them.
The Bigfoot walked by my side through the trees until we got to the sequestered country road, where the two cars were parked, the car belonging to Oliver and the car belonging to his wife Simone. That was when I observed that my sister-in-law Simone was sitting in the front seat of Oliver's car. I discovered her lying there slumped on the seat. She had been knocked out cold and was slowly but surely coming around, slurring her words like an inebriated drunk. She was certainly confused and disorientated and didn't seem to know where she was. I suspected Oliver had knocked her out to prevent her from calling the police, while he pursued me to ensure that he took me out, so I would not impose a threat to him. I'm sure he believed he could control Simone, so that he could finally get his grubby hands on Elspeth's inheritance. I called the police to tell them what had happened, admitting, of course, that Oliver had been attacked by a Bigfoot. That I did not mention. I feigned surprise when they claimed they'd discovered his deceased body, and they never really got to the bottom of how he died, but I wisely said nothing. I was to find the annoying detective that had kept hounding me to ask questions all about Simone and her husband, who had been investigating the death of my mother-in-law, had had a gut feeling from the very beginning that Oliver was behind her demise. But I have to say, with Oliver out of the picture, life was so much better for the all of us. 2 years later, I can hear the trill of merry laughter in the living room as I carry away the dirty dishes from the finished main course back into the kitchen. Simone is trailing behind me. She's heavily pregnant with twins. The last IVF treatment she had was a huge success, and both fetuses took. She looks radiant, and her face is glowing with contentment, and she has met a wonderful man to share her life with. They got married over a year ago. "Where is he?" she asks me excitedly, as she dashes over to the kitchen sink and slips the dirty dishes into the soapy water. She is rambunctiously enthusiastic. My heart sinks, because I'm not sure the Bigfoot will show himself to Simone. Simone seems to read my thoughts, because she gingerly asks me, "Do you think he'll show himself to me, Claudia?" "I'm not sure," I say. "I see him most nights, but he's incredibly intuitive, so he'll know you're here, and he might not wish to show himself to you." Simone looks visibly disappointed. "Why not?" she asks. I shrug my shoulders. "I don't understand it myself," I tell her, "but I know that the Bigfoot is very selective about who he shows himself to. My son has seen him a few times, but my husband and daughter have never seen him before." "But I want to see him so much," said Simone, her voice sounding almost urgent. "I mean, if it wasn't for him, you would almost certainly be dead, and I'd likely be under the formidable control of Oliver, who would be ensuring I kept my mouth shut over everything. Thanks to that Bigfoot, life is so much better for me these days. I know it's an awful thing to say, but it's true." I had no idea how much Oliver controlled me and eroded all my confidence. I had such a low self-esteem back then. I turned a blind eye to his licentious behaviour, but now look at me. I'm a whole new woman. Even the way I met James was bizarre, don't you think? I mean, when do you ever meet a romantic partner in a computer shop of all things? I never even talked to anyone beyond the shop assistants in a computer store. But there James was. And I know it sounds crazy and nonsensical, but he walked over to me and said,
"I don't mean to intrude, but don't waste your money on that computer over there, when you can buy a cheaper model that's equally as efficient."
Even now, he doesn't know why he did it. He said it was like a nudge that propelled him forwards. And I think it was my mother that brought us together. I really do. "You know what, Simone?" I said. "I believe you. Nothing would surprise me about that woman. Even in death, I suspect she's watching over us." We stand at the kitchen sink together, and Simone almost drops the plate in her hands onto the kitchen floor. Her pretty face bursts into a bright, jubilant smile. "I see him! I see him over there! He's so beautiful, better than I ever imagined. There he is, crossing your red brick driveway." The moon was bright that evening. We could see the Bigfoot so clearly. He stood there patiently, looking at us through the kitchen window, carrying something in his overlong arms that looked like a dead squirrel. He nodded at us twice. Normally he only nods at me once, so he was clearly acknowledging Simone. He stood there for a second longer, and I hear him saying in my head,
"I'm watching over you, to keep you safe, as I've promised."
We watched him glide away, looking as if he was floating on air as he moved through the trees. "Oh my goodness," said Simone. "He spoke to me. Claudia, he spoke to me. He said, 'Congratulations. You're having a girl and a boy.' How can he know that, Simone? How does he even know I'm pregnant?" "I have no idea," I said to Simone. "But in my experience, that Bigfoot has outer-worldly abilities. He just knows things." James, Simone's husband, comes rushing into the kitchen.
"What do you two look so pleased about?" he asked.
"I would tell you," said Simone, grinning, "but you wouldn't believe me if I did. But you know what, James? I've got a funny feeling that we're about to have a girl and a boy."
"I thought you thought we were having 2 boys," he laughed. "Why this sudden change of mind?"
"I don't know," said Simone. "I guess I've had some kind of a prognostication, you could say."
"Well, don't stay in the kitchen, gassing," said James. "We're looking forward to dessert. That apple pie smells absolutely delicious, and I, for one, am very hungry for something sweet."
"Coming up," said Simone, staring out of the window to see if she can see the Bigfoot again. But he's long gone. "I can't believe he showed himself to me," she says to me, her eyes shining brightly. "I think he wanted you to see him," I said. And Simone chuckles happily to herself. "I'm having a girl and a boy," she says. "I've had it affirmed by a Bigfoot." So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. And I feel very sorry for poor Simone, because she was married to a frightful man who was literally willing to do anything for his mother-in-law's money. And that is just horrifying. But you do get people like that in this world. There's a lot of greed out there. But what an amazing story. And wasn't it fantastic that the Bigfoot came to the rescue? And this was a Bigfoot she saw every evening when she was washing dishes. And what were the chances he'd be watching over her when she was literally running for her life from that awful man? And things ended up perfect for all of them. And I'm so glad to see that Simone got her life back together and also got her dream of having the 2 children that she so desperately wanted to have.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.